All right, I will take this time to introduce the moderator of the next panel. Rich Mathias has been involved with Young Americans for Freedom for a number of years, and he is in many ways the driving force behind this leadership conference, having worked very closely with Richard Hahn and other members of the staff. The next concept that will be discussed by these experts deals with the concept of rolling back the Soviet Empire. Not just containing it, but the concept of rolling it back, repatriating peoples and land. It's a very important idea that is in many ways consistent with what is embodied within the Shannon Statement. We stress victory over, not coexistence with communism. And this victory requires a slow process at times, slower than we would want, but a slow rollback of the Soviet hegemony on this planet. Without much further ado, let me introduce a leader of Young Americans for Freedom for the Future, Rich Mathias.
Thank you, Bob. The current panel session is a very interesting one with regard to a new strategic approach in terms of foreign policy, rolling back the Soviet Empire, and in fact returning to the original thesis of détente, which was not simply to contain our hemispheric position and contain the Soviet Union and to contain the totalitarian regime of the communists, but rather to try to reverse inwardly the internal situation in Soviet Russia. And these four speakers we have today provide us with a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and a certain variety of perspective. We have individuals who have a very keen interest in Afghanistan. We have an individual who has a very keen experience of the Soviet Union. We have an individual who is fighting this very day for the salvation of Nicaragua. And we would like to begin this particular panel with General Roberts, who is the chairman and acting executive director of the Committee of a Free Afghanistan. Major Roberts has been a board member of the Committee for Free Afghanistan since it was founded and is also a founding member of the U.S.-Pakistan Alliance. He recently retired from his post as the executive director of the Reserve Officers Association after over 9 years of service. He is currently serving as the national co-chairman of the Coalition for Peace Through Strength. In addition, he serves as the vice president and director of the American Security Council, vice president and director of the National Intelligence Study Center, and vice president of the National Historic Intelligence Museum. It is indeed an honor for us to welcome to us this afternoon General J. Milner Roberts.
Thank you very much, Rich. It is a real pleasure to be here. Some years ago, I used to be able to call myself a young American for freedom, but I've grown up a little bit since then. I guess I'm no longer in the young category. Of course, I was an inmate in the Pentagon. Rich didn't mention that. For about 5 years, from 1970 to 75, and then I became a refugee from there and went across the river and got involved in more interesting things. Well, I'm here today to talk about a situation which is unique, and that is the situation in Afghanistan. What's unique about it? It's unique in that this is the only place in the world where Soviet troops have been committed since 1945. They have been pretty good at using their proxies. Cubans, East Germans, you name it, but they haven't had the Soviet air and the Soviet armor and the Soviet mechanized infantry and, yes, Soviet chemical weapons in active use anywhere but there. Afghanistan is on the front line. Some people seem to forget that at times. Another key reason why Afghanistan is important is its strategic location in the world. If some of you know your geography, you will realize that Afghanistan stands between the Soviet Union and penetration through Pakistan to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. And access to a warm port has been an ambition of imperial Russia, to say nothing of communist Russia, for several hundred years. Furthermore, if you look at your atlas, you will see that Iran is on the west. And what's west of Iran? The Persian Gulf. Now the Soviets are very busy constructing airfields in the western part of Afghanistan, from which, within a relatively few minutes, they have access to the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, is that bottleneck at the bottom of the Persian Gulf through which more than half of the oil for our NATO friends in Europe passes. It is a very strategic place. That's the reason that the Soviets have risked the enmity of many people around the world by their brutal aggression. So what's happened in the last 4.5 years? I have to confess to you that Afghanistan has been used as a political pawn, unfortunately. You may recall that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979 in December. This was right after the previous president, Mr. Carter, had tried to force the SALT II treaty through the Senate of the United States. I, for one, was much opposed to it, along with most people who knew the military facts. He knew he wasn't going to get it through, and so he used Afghanistan for an excuse. We're not going to sign the SALT II treaty, or ratify it rather, because of Afghanistan. This was a political stratagem not too favorable to Afghanistan. Then, in 1980, with Mr. Carter running for re-election, and with his record on national security not all that great, what did he do? He said, we're going to pull out of the Olympics because of Afghanistan. Well, I happen to believe that the main reason he did that was to make himself look a little better for the election in November. Now, at the present time, our policy is not too much better. It reminds me of the rationale for our actions in Korea all those many years ago. Long before most of you were born, General MacArthur had moved aggressively in the Korean Peninsula, had moved up to the Yalu River, the border with Red China, was prepared to destroy the bridges over the Yalu and deny the Red Chinese an easy opportunity to move in with their hordes of manpower. What happened? Our leadership at the time said, oh, we better not do that. We might make them mad. And furthermore, we might make the Soviet Union mad. So what happened was a debacle. Our forces were pushed back almost the whole way down the coastline, and finally we have a stalemate which has existed now for over 30 years. Vietnam. What was the rationale there? The rationale was, well, if we really go into Hanoi and knock them out and take over North Vietnam, which we could have done, the Red Chinese will be mad, and they will assault us, and maybe the Soviet Union too. So we were involved in a situation like somebody fighting an octopus with all his tentacles. You chop at the tentacles, don't hit them in the middle. You do that forever. Now we're doing the same thing in Afghanistan in a way. Why is our government not doing more? Because they don't want to make the Soviet Union mad. Yeah, they'll tell you that. That has been the official policy. Oh, we really can't get involved there too much because the Soviets might get mad. And what would they do then? Well, they'd make things worse for the people in Afghanistan. You mean worse than burning them out? Worse than starving them to death? Worse than bombing their hospitals, their temples, churches, killing their people? I don't know about that. And furthermore, they might go into Pakistan. Well, we think there are pretty good reasons why they wouldn't. And so what we want to do is to encourage our members of Congress and our administration to do more to help the people, the brave and courageous people who are fighting, and they're the only ones fighting the Soviets directly in Afghanistan. And we can do a lot. In the first place, we have been giving them some covert aid, as you've read. Unfortunately, it's not very much. We can give them more military equipment, especially shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons, Stinger, Red-Eye, because this is their greatest problem. The freedom fighters have a terrible time resisting when the gunships of the Soviet Union attack them, to say nothing of high-performance aircraft. Also, another thing they badly need are mine detectors and communications equipment. These people will fight on to the last man with their Lee Enfield rifles and the AK-47s they've captured from the Soviets, but they're not going to win that way. And they need medical attention. Medical attention there is terrible. It's if you're wounded severely in Afghanistan and you're a freedom fighter, you're just about as good as dead. There are 30 French doctors who have gone into the country. 30. There are seven Afghan doctors helping the freedom fighters. And just recently, the first American surgeon went in to help the freedom fighters and ran a clinic under canvas. Well, what can we do? We can supply them with more volunteer medical people who will go in, who will risk their lives to assist the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters. We can also provide food, which can be carried in country on the backs of people and on mules. And we can give them added courage to resist by the fact that we are then helping them more. There is one ray of hope in this attitude, and that is that just 2 weeks ago, the Secretary of Defense authorized treatment for 7 very badly wounded Mujahideen at the Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington. And this, at least, was a breakthrough. Here was the United States government doing something besides the covert aid which had been supplied for some time. So Afghanistan is important in resisting Soviet aggression. It's something that we can do a lot more of to resist. And certainly for humanitarian reasons, we've got to come to further assistance to the brave people of Afghanistan who have already lost 1 million dead, with almost 6 million refugees, most of them out of the country, who continue to fight on. They're fighting our fight. We should help them more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is an individual who has served over 27 years of distinguished service in the United States Navy. Rhett McDaniel was born in 1931 And after retiring from the Navy in 1982, he became the director of a very important group in this country, the American Defense Foundation, a very important group for promoting free defense ideas and emphasizing the importance of a strong national defense and an issue of peace through strength. Red McDaniel presently serves as the president of that organization, authored many books, articles, lectures, and other things which have made him one of the chief spokesmen for a strong defense in this nation. He was awarded the Navy's highest award for bravery in the Naval Cross and is the owner of 2 Purple Hearts for wounds resulting in his combat in the Navy. He is author of The Scars and Stripes, which is a book telling about his 6 years of torture in the communist prison camp as a POW. We are very honored this afternoon to have Red McDaniel with us.
Thank you. Good, thank you. Good, thank you. Thank you for that very warm ovation. I'm one of the few people that can say they'd rather be red than dead. First off, I'm not a professional speaker. I was an athlete in high school and college. Consequently, I graduated almost untouched by education. In fact, somebody once asked me if I finished the upper half of my class. And I said no, but I made the upper half possible. But I want to share with you today some thoughts. The thoughts that I'm going to share are tempered by my background, having flown 81 combat missions, having seen wingmen shot out of the sky and killed, having been taken captive myself, seen cellmates tortured to death by the communist system. So take what I'm saying in that light. On May 19th, 1967, one morning about 10 o'clock, I walked up to the flight deck on aircraft carrier Enterprise, strapped in an A-6, an all-weather bomber, with a young man, Lieutenant James Kelly Patterson, who was killed on that mission. We were catapulted off to a flying speed of 160 knots in about 2.5 seconds. We climbed out to 20,000 feet and rendezvoused with 25 other aircraft from Enterprise. And we proceeded inbound to attack a target located deep within the city of Hanoi. About 30 miles prior to the target, while dodging the 4th missile that was fired at my aircraft, the missile looks like a telephone pole coming up, Mach 1.5, but if you can see that missile, you can outmaneuver it, because we had wings, it did not. While I was dodging the 4th missile, I was hit by number 5, which I never saw. And on impact, the aircraft pitched down, out of control, began to accelerate, and began to burn. My navigator said, let's eject. But had we ejected, at that moment, we'd been captured right away, so we looked out ahead and saw a mountain range some 10 miles away. So we held a little conference, very brief, I might add. But rode that burning aircraft, reached those mountains, and then he ejected. I must wait 1 second for if we eject together, our seats collide, and by this time we're near supersonic. He came down on one side of the mountain, and I came down on the far side. And as I came down, the enemy was still shooting because you're fair game until you strike the ground. As I came down, the top of my parachute caught on a tree limb, and I was dangling about 40 feet above the ground. But rather than fall those 40 feet and risk injury, I tried to climb up the rises to reach the limb that I was hung on to go into the trunk to come down. As I reached the limb peeled away, and I fell 50 feet to the ground, and when I did, I crushed 2 vertebrae in my back and was paralyzed in the jungles of North Vietnam. It was there in that jungle at age 36 that my faith was tested for the first time. I prayed for miracles. I prayed that God would lift me from that jungle back to my ship. But instead, I was captured the next day, and I was taken 2 days away to prison because I couldn't walk. When I got to prison, I expected medical treatment. Instead, I received 3 days of twisting rope torture. And that torture was supervised by the Soviets that were in the camp. But I survived that ordeal. I survived the elements for 6 years, brutal torture again in 1969 after an escape attempt. Came home March 4th in excellent health without ever receiving any medical treatment, testifying to God's great healing power. Only God has the power to grant that. The common thread of our survival there was faith. Faith in a great God and faith in a great nation.
Throughout my 6 years there, I heard everything that was bad and sad about America, about all the young people demonstrating in the streets in the 60s, about the riots in Kent State where people were killed. They tried to demoralize us. But having lived in America, having known this freedom and having that freedom taken away, because there's nothing worse than being a prisoner of war, death would have been welcomed. Because as a prisoner of war, you have no self-esteem, you have no pride, your every action is controlled by the enemy. He tells you when to eat, when to sleep, when to get up. But having lived in this country, I'd learned to appreciate my freedom. And I used to look out at those guards on guard duty who were more captive than we were, and I would say to myself that someday we're going home to freedom, but they were never to know the joys of living in a free land. With our many problems in this country, we still have the freest, the fairest, and the finest country in the world. If you don't believe it, leave it for 6 years as I did. I learned to appreciate freedom, but for my release in prison, we negotiated with the Soviets for 5 years. And 3 of those years we're trying to decide whether we sit around a square table or a round table. In the last 2 years we got down to business. I never doubted that we'd be coming home, but I did wonder when it would happen, and I wondered how it would happen. On November 1st, 1968, then President Johnson stopped the bombing of North Vietnam for one reason: to have impact on an election in this country between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. And when you're inside a communist prison looking out, and the bombers don't come for 3.5 years, it gives you a lot of food for thought. We had a lot of time to think and a lot of reason to think. And to me, that marked the beginning of military decay in this country. But finally, on March 4th, 1973, after a decision was made by then President Nixon to send the B-52s to Hanoi, they bombed around the clock for 10 days, and when the bombers stopped, we knew we'd be coming home. And I personally feel that we were within 2 or 3 days of total surrender of North Vietnam had we continued bombing a little longer. I don't know what we would have done if they had surrendered, because we don't need it. But we had them right down on their knees. And when we were released on March 4th, I came out in the second group of 115 men. On that day, I was very happy, but I was also very apprehensive. I wondered if there'd be a place for me in America after having lived in a vacuum for 6 years. But when I got home, I found that just as I'd always believed in my country, it still believed in us. We were given the opportunity to stay in the Navy, to get out, to get back onto the fast track and compete. And I opted for the latter. I got current again in the A6, threw it up through carrier landing phase, and was selected to command a couple ships. USS Niagara Falls, a combat support ship, and an aircraft carrier, USS Lexington. It was in that job, and that ship manned by 3,600 young men, average age 19 years and 2 months, that my faith in America was restored. The young people of this country, the future is in your hands, and that's why I'm here today, because I believe in you. I also believe that lengthening shadow of communism that we hear so much about is very real. It can't be wished away, it can't be prayed away. It's something that we must face squarely. The only language the Soviets understand is a language backed up by military might and a resolve and will to use that might if necessary. And I pray every day that no young American will ever again have to face armed conflict. But I believe with every fiber of my being, the only way to have peace is to be strong militarily. And I'd rather be strong and never need it than the other way around. Another point, shortly after I came home, I saw a paper from a Harvard campus magazine, and the statement went like this, and I quote, "Nothing is worth dying for." Nothing is worth dying for. I wondered when I saw that statement what we had done to cause one of our young people in America to say that nothing is worth dying for. I have 2 sons, one 26, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a lieutenant in the Navy, I have another son who's draft age. I pray that neither will ever have to see armed conflict, but I also pray that neither will ever say, nothing is worth dying for. Because if it isn't worth dying for, then it isn't worth living for. Because to be born free as we are in America is strictly an accident. To live free, though, I believe is a responsibility. And to die free is an obligation. God bless you.
Thank you very much. Very, very inspirational words from a man who's seen a perspective none of us have, and hopefully none of us ever will. We now turn this part of the program over to a couple of gentlemen who have reached conclusions about the international strategic environment from a different perspective, one from outside of this nation. We all hear so often about the fight that exists in Central America, Nicaragua in particular, how the Contras in that country are trying to topple the Sandinista regime of terror. Yet we sometimes often are eluded from the facts by our national media, who tell us things that we don't need to hear because they are either false, misled, or contorted. We are very pleased this afternoon to have an individual who has dedicated his life to ensure a free Nicaragua. I believe it was about a month ago in a speech I made before a group in Washington that I made the observation that no other individual has ever been asked or ever called to give more to his country than the effort to retrieve the freedom and liberty in that nation against a hostile government upon which his life can be removed at any time. The movements of the Contras in Nicaragua are a refreshing revision of loyalty to country. In Central America, Nicaragua is trying to release itself of the terror of the Sandinistas. Adolfo Calero is here with us this afternoon. He is chairman of the National Directorate of the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or the Frente Democrática Nicaragüense. He is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the FDN. This body of Contras in Nicaragua are trying desperately to overrule the Sandinistas and restore freedom to that country. And we are very pleased to welcome Adolfo Calero.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying that the word contra means counter-revolutionary, and that word was coined by the communists, and it's been served to you by your press. And so, by calling us contras, you are making use of communist terminology. And really, what we are, what we consider ourselves is freedom fighters, liberators, or whatever you might, revolutionaries, really, and but not contras. We are not against something. We are for democracy, for what it stands for. Anyway, that's an extra thought. I just came from speaking to some Florida congressman. I told him I was going to speak to you, young fellows from YAF, and he says, that's a good group. And I said, yes, I'll be preaching to the choir, but that's what preachers generally do, no? I mean, and the fact Florida youth gave me an association, and I thought about the fountain of youth that many people, I understand, are still looking for in Florida. And on an afterthought, I said, well, what we have all found here this week in Texas is a fountain of patriotism. And that's my perception. I have perceived that from the speeches made by the various people at the convention, from talking to different people, from the platform that has been elaborated by the Republican Party, and really, the days are gone when this country, all that it needed was a good 5-cent cigar. I mean, that's, I mean, those days are over, really. The needs are much greater than they were ever before. We're, if not on the threshold, we're really in the midst of a big confrontation between communism and democracy. On the one side, we have the United States, leader of the Western world. We have now going in this country a conservative revolution, and I insist on calling it a revolution because it is a revolution. It's bringing values to you, also to us, your friends, that we need to advance, not only preserve, but we need to advance. And we need to advance not only in our own countries, but also in other countries. The blame the United States first attitude that was so well presented by Mrs. Kirkpatrick should always be kept in mind by you young men. You do not have to apologize for this country. What you have to do is further the beliefs and the values of this country, because they are good. And do not believe what you read in the press, what you read in the media here, that are always apologizing for this country. You will find in polls in Central America that the most popular country in Central America, with the exception of Nicaragua, where polls have been forbidden after one poll in 1981 showed that 65% of the people were already against the Sandinistas. Well, these polls in Central America have shown that the most popular country is the United States, that President Reagan's policies with regards to Central America, they are in agreement with 80% of the people, 85%, I believe, of the people in Honduras are in agreement with the policies of this administration. That's even higher than what you have in this country. 75% in Costa Rica are in agreement with these policies. 70-some-odd% in El Salvador. I mean, but you never hear that here. I mean, here, what you get is the contrary. That in Central America, the United States is hated, and that is an absolute untruth, and you should be aware of it, and you should act accordingly. On the other side, we have the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has, since the founding of the Duchy of Muscovy back in the 16th century, expanded its frontiers every 30 years by territory the size of Alaska. So you can well imagine what that means. The Tsars started that. The communists have been nothing but the followers of the Tsars. The policies of the Soviet Union, of Russia, let's say, have not changed. The only thing is that before, their ideology was different, and now it is totalitarian, it is communistic, it enslaves people. And so Soviet expansionism has to be checked somewhere. We, Nicaraguans, have decided to check it in Nicaragua, to stop it there. At one point, we had the support of your government. We do not have it any longer since May. We have kept on fighting, however. We will keep on fighting. We are no one's creation. We appreciate and we are thankful for any support we get from this country, from this government, from people in this country, as we are getting now, from people in other countries. But we must all keep in mind that we were born out of the necessity to have freedom in Nicaragua, because we do not want to live as slaves. And something that started with a few hundred a couple of years ago, now we have an army of 10,000 men who are fighting so close to the capital, close to the capital city of Managua. We have groups within 60 or 70 miles of the capital city of Managua. We have a very high morale, we have discipline, we have courage, but most of all, we have the will and we have the decision to be free. And we need the support of this country. I was listening that the Afghans have only gotten covert aid, and now they're getting a few more things. Well, in our case, even though we are closer to Texas than Texas is of Washington, we are not getting even that support. We're not getting even covert aid support. But going back to the position of the United States, I want to leave with you the message that you do not have to apologize for this country. Let the United States be the United States. This country was made great by a pioneer spirit which has to remain with it. You cannot grow old and weak. You have to keep on growing. You have to keep on being strong. You have to keep on holding your own. And if that is done, you will be happy, and we, your friends, will also be happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Calero. The struggle in Central America is certainly one that we always try to find more information about, because it's one that transcends the overall struggle that exists between the free world and the enslaved. Our next speaker is one who can speak from a position of unique knowledge with regard to the latter conflict, that of the enslaved. Dr. Igor Glogolev served as a senior advisor on the negotiating team for the SALT I Treaty of the Soviet government, has since realized that there are some differences in the free world that must be preserved. And he is here with us today to discuss with us his new book, which he has just released, entitled The Post-Andropov Kremlin Strategy. Dr. Glogolev is the current director of the Association for Cooperation of Democratic Countries. He is a lecturer involved in the Program for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, the Center for Strategic International Studies at Georgetown University, and the University of St. Thomas, the Hudson Institute as well. He also served, when he was in the Soviet Union, as the part-time consultant of the Soviet government on arms control between 1957 and 1976. Dr. Glogolev has authored his recent book, The Post-Andropov Kremlin Strategy. Has also written two other books, 1964, Influence of Disarmament on Economy, and the International Security and Economic Development in 1974. We are very pleased to welcome today Dr. Igor Glogolev.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, 40 years ago, the Soviet Empire consisted of two states. Part of the Soviet Union, the other part was occupied by the German troops, and Mongolia, which is a desert. Now, the Soviet sphere of influence includes more than 100 states, socialist-oriented states. These states, the governments, dictatorial regimes, support the Soviet aggressors in the United Nations against the United States. For instance, during the voting in the General Assembly of the United Nations on liberation of Grenada. It means that every year after the Second World War, every year 2 or 3 countries were surrendered to the communists or their allies. More than that, the Western governments and commercial banks gave more than $600 billion to these pro-Soviet governments as credits and loans, while the Soviet bloc was killing, the forces of the Soviet bloc were killing American soldiers in Korea and Vietnam, and tens of millions of other innocent people. And more than that, during the last 20 years, the United States of America reduced the aggregate yield of its strategic forces by more than 80%. So, the Soviet Union, which of course increased its offensive and defensive strategic forces, acquired the ability to destroy the United States, to kill, wound, burn, or contaminate the whole population of the United States, and to put out of action almost all the retaliatory weapons of the United States. I'm sorry to say that these 3 processes continue till now. The new governments of Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia voted together with the Soviet Union against the United States, and they're building socialism in their respective countries. So we are losing still one country after another. The credits and loans to the Soviet bloc continue. Vice President Bush especially actively promotes these credits, and I think we should take his position into account in 1988. And I'm sorry to say that the present administration has not, well, of course it's much better than the previous administration, no doubt about it, but it has not deployed any ICBMs during the 4 years, any strategic bombers, any anti-satellite weapons, and any ballistic missile defense weapons. Speaking, of course, promising for the future, something. So, in my opinion, we should have a better administration in 1988. Of course, we should vote for Reagan. We should insist that he begins at last the restoration of the American strategic deterrent, that he restores the aid to the freedom fighters, and he should also help not only President Reagan, but any American government and any Western government, all these governments, and of course such organizations as the Young Americans for Freedom, they should help also the freedom fighters in Russia. During the 1974 elections to the Supreme Soviet in the Soviet Union, when I was a special representative of these elections, 70 million voters refused to vote for the communist candidates. 2 million voters in Moscow only. That is the capital of the Soviet Union. This is a huge anti-communist party in the Soviet Union, actually, but they don't know about it. So the Voice of America should broadcast these figures to the Soviet Union systematically. Well, it has broadcast some of this information. But all these problems should be discussed by the Voice of America systematically. And the key to the liberation of all the socialist-dominated countries, communist-dominated, socialist-dominated, the key to the liberation is the liberation armies. I'm against a nuclear war, but a nuclear war can be prevented not only by the effective strategic deterrent of the United States, but also with the development of the freedom movement in the Soviet bloc, including the Soviet Union itself. And actually, this liberation movement has already begun. And it has begun in Afghanistan. Some guerrillas in Afghanistan are actually Tajiks, Turkmen, Uzbeks, and recently Russian and Ukrainian soldiers began to defect from the Soviet army to support the guerrillas, and some of them came to the United States and participated in our activities. Our Coalition for a Free Russia has a program which was announced in 1981 at our first Congress in Washington. This is free enterprise and democracy for Russia and for all the peoples of the Soviet Empire. Freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. And I must tell you that these ideas are extremely popular in the Soviet Union itself. The universities of the Soviet Union are the main centers of opposition. Main centers. I was myself there, these universities, and my family was there. So what we need close cooperation with these freedom movements everywhere, but especially in the Soviet Union, because only a victory of freedom in the Soviet Union will guarantee prevention of a nuclear war. According to our program, which is very popular in the Soviet Union among the opposition, Free Russia will have no weapons against the United States. Actually, we have concluded a preliminary agreement between Free Russia and the United States of America to our Congress. Free Russia should be the best friend of the United States. And I think this goal is quite realistic. If we help the opposition in the Soviet Union now with radio transmitters, portable radio transmitters, and weapons, this opposition will be able, of course it will be a long fight, to topple the Soviet dictatorial regime and to introduce free enterprise and democracy in Russia. I think it should be an extremely important goal for the free world. Thank you very much.
At this juncture in our program, we're going to enter into a 30-minute phase of questions and answers. I would just like to kindly ask the speakers, if they could, to bring their chairs up to the stage here, and so we can focus the attention on the stage for the Q&A for the next 30 minutes. And then they'll be recognized, and then each of the questions answered in their turn. And please address your question to each of the panelists that they'd like to answer, so they can get the answer that you want to get. You can certainly tell that we have the most diversified field of experience. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can ask Ed McDaniel to be the MC as far as picking up the questioners, so you can see from online. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. First of all, will I change, switch to affect the United States?
I was always an anti-communist, so I didn't change anything, but I had an idea to change the system in the Soviet Union. So when the democratic revolution was there, and this was the idea actually of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the system was changed to some extent in the time of Khrushchev. Several million political prisoners were liberated. The personnel in military forces was reduced by 40% without any agreements. Solzhenitsyn was published with huge circulation, anti-communist books by Solzhenitsyn and other ones. And well, personally, I was very close to the government at that time. But then, this government was toppled, and the new government of Brezhnev, Chernenko, and Andropov began to prepare a nuclear attack on the United States, to arrest and execute freedom fighters in Russia, and then I saw that it was impossible for me and other Democrats there to change the system. So I decided to come here and discuss these problems, and I could not discuss them openly, of course, in the Soviet Union.
My second question is to you, Mr. McDaniel. Have you ever met Senator Benton? Because I understand he suffered the same experience you did.
Yes, I've known Senator Denton for 35 years. We were squadron mates, ship mates, cell mates, and tried to be congressional mates, but I didn't make it. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I'd like to ask Senor Calero what his opinion is of Investor and the Democratic Revolutionary Alliance, and is there a possibility of finding a
Yes. Well, last month we signed an agreement or an accord with the Revolutionary Alliance. However, Mr. Pastora had left the Revolutionary Alliance before the agreement was signed. So FDN, that has been in very close coordination with the Misuras out of the northern part of Nicaragua, and Arde, which has been fighting in the south, now have an alliance. Mr. Pastora is out. Our opinion of Pastora is that he is unpredictable. One doesn't know what to expect from him. I know him, we've spoken many times. One Nicaraguan newspaperman described him at one time as a man who, if there was a christening, he wanted to be the baby. If there was a wedding, he wanted to be the groom. And if there was a funeral, he wanted to be the dead man. Yes?
I have a question for Mr. Glover. Americans have been given to understand that the Soviet people may be disgruntled with the current government, but still generally support it because they view it as the best protection against other countries repeating what the Germans did in World War II. Is that true, and is there some other word around that problem?
This is the KGB disinformation repeated by the liberal media of the West. There are tens of millions of Soviet citizens whose relatives were killed by the communists. Fathers, mothers, sisters, friends. The country is full of such people. And they hate the system. It's not just mild opposition. They hate it.
And when his turn came, the lady said, "Niet, communist, niet," and wouldn't sell him anything. Yes, sir.
I would ask where we can buy his, order his book.
Well, I'll bring some books tomorrow, so maybe we can share. But in general, it will be available here in Dallas, in the bookshops.
It's my understanding that the Soviet Union is using Afghanistan as sort of a training ground for its troops. So really a two-part question, that is, first of all, how soon are they going to be ready to nail in the final, how soon are they going to be ready to put the final nail in the coffin, if indeed that's not what they're doing now? And once they decide to do that, how long would it take them if the United States continues its policy, which really is nothing at this point?
Well, they tried with a military operation this spring in Panjshir Valley, which they thought was going to really destroy the guts of the freedom fighters and lead to a conclusion of the struggle. However, our friends in Mujahideen have moles inside Kabul, the capital, and they got word of what the Soviets were planning to do, and so they took steps to avoid disaster, and it turned into a debacle actually for the Soviet Union, who lost quite a bit of equipment and personnel. So this major military strike didn't come off very well for them. Basically, it's our judgment that the Soviets have decided that they'll never be able to, at any kind of reasonable cost, subject the Afghan people militarily and stamp it out just by military means. So what they're trying to do now is to starve them out burn their fields, and literally create a famine, which they have done elsewhere in the past. But we want to see that this doesn't happen, and I mentioned before why we need to support more food going in and more effective weapons.
I'd like to comment briefly on that. Since I came home from Vietnam in 1973, 11 countries, including Afghanistan, has undergone communist, well, 10 countries have been dominated by communism, and Afghanistan has a fight for freedom going on. But I think the Soviet Union is at a crossroads. Every country that they conquered, the 100 countries that they now occupy, is controlled by military might, by force. And I think they are getting to the point they've got to start winning the hearts and minds of the people, which they haven't been able to do. And I think, hopefully, the people from within those countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, other countries, will rebel and hope someday free those countries. The next question? I mean, nobody wants to ask me how much I like Jane Fonda? Yes.
Why the Vietnam veterans haven't done something about Jane Fonda? She's a pet hero of mine.
Well, Jane Fonda is not one of my favorite people either. When she came to Hanoi, we were forced to torture to go downtown to meet with her, and one of the worst things that we had happen there was 2 American citizens came to Hanoi saying what we were being tortured to say freely, and my cellmate was tortured for 7 days, 7 nights without sleep until he weakened enough to go downtown and meet with the delegation. And when he got down, one American citizen, Sandra Smith of Michigan, started asking him some questions, some of which he answered, some of which he refused because they were un-American. And she turned to the Vietnamese officer that escorted him down and said, "This man has a bad attitude." Talking about my cellmate, he was brought back to camp and was tortured again for refusing to answer this American citizen's question. That's what Jane Fonda represented to us. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, the Soviet Union rather take us over than not. They'd rather have all our resources attack us with weapons. They'd rather demoralize us like this.
The question, I think, was, do you think the Soviet Union would rather bomb us and destroy us to conquer us, or to just to go ahead and demoralize us from within through disinformation, I think?
Well, this is a very good question. The first goal of the Soviet KGB system is to bring Mondale to power. Yes. So the whole system of Soviet propaganda and disinformation now is directed towards this goal. They attack Reagan every day exactly in the same way as Mondale and Ferraro do. They also say that Reagan robs the poor, gives this money to the rich. So they also attack the MX, they attack the B-1 bomber, they attack the ballistic missile defense. That's exactly the points of the program of the Democratic Party. And also these are the main points of the program of the United States Communist Party, which supports Mondale and Ferraro. So this is the goal number 1, but they will probably fail on this. So after the elections, there will be, I think, a very dangerous time, as you correctly mentioned, because they can try their nuclear weapons. So we must be prepared. We must not study the ballistic missile defense. No, I mean, it is studies. The Defense Department has already tested this defense. Why should we study? We should deploy the ballistic missile defense and deploy all the weapons system which we have planned. This is an urgent necessity.
Yes.
Yes, is there anything that we can do that we are not doing to find out about the MIA from POWs in Vietnam, Cambodia?
A good question. Is there anything we can do about the POW MIA? So let me tell you my position. I was held captive in North Vietnam, Hanoi, for 6 years, moved 17 times within 5 different camps. When I came out for 8 years, I said absolutely not. There were no prisoners left in North Vietnam only, because that's the only country I was familiar with. My wife's Cedar was alive on the ground for 4 days after the ejection disappeared. We had 57 men in camp with us, all who disappeared. Some died of disease, some were tortured to death. We know 30 or 40 were. For 8 years I said no, but I went to Capitol Hill in 1978 where I worked for 3 years representing the Navy and Marine Corps, and I took a lot of congressmen to Capitol to Pentagon for briefings, because since 1975, 10% of the South Vietnamese have put to sea hoping for freedom in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. From that 10%, we have 600 sightings of Caucasians in Southeast Asia. We've eliminated 400 of those sightings, but we have 186 that are still working, that are active. And so, yes, today I think there are men still alive. Perhaps not a lot. I think in Laos, perhaps controlled by warlords, and I think we're talking about less than 50 men, but that's all conjecture on my part. Yes, sir.
Earlier you were discussing James Bond. I am curious, different from your adulthood, to hear your opinions of Reverend Jesse Jackson's exploits.
Well, Jesse Jackson, you know, we started talking a little earlier about the prior to the Reagan administration, the Carter administration, and Jimmy Carter incidentally only had 2 weaknesses, foreign and domestic. Well, let me tell you what Jesse Jackson has done. I just came back from Europe. We, through the American Defense Foundation, one of our efforts is to register military people to vote. And we had a trip to Europe where we went aboard several aircraft carriers. We visited soldiers in Frankfurt, Heidelberg, Air Force in Ramstein, Stuttgart. The Navy today is 85% registered, compared to 35% in 1982. And I was given that opportunity because some fellow preceded me in Europe, went to Navy bases saying un-American things to soldiers in auditoriums, and I was given the same platform. I was not, what I'm doing is bipartisan. But I believe the people who are in the military voluntarily will vote for a strong national defense. I think they will support present policy, and you're going to see the largest turnout in 1984, and the person who made that possible is Jesse Jackson.
Are we here? We have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
This is directed towards you. There are some critics that say the bombing of North Vietnam was ineffective, Rolling Thunder 1 and I guess Rolling Thunder 2. What's your comment on that?
A good question. We fought a no-win war in Vietnam. We committed 3 million of our young men, but we never committed to harm the nation. We did it to fight a protracted war to give the Vietnamese a fighting spirit, but when they got the fighting spirit, we withdrew our support, they ran. But the only time we bombed Hanoi seriously was in 1972 when the B-52s came. President Nixon made a decision which was very unpopular, and for 10 days we didn't sleep. They evacuated the city for the first time of all non-essential personnel, and the rats, who are more creative than we are, began to feed on us in the evening, and we posted a rat watch. And I can assure you, if we bombed them for a few more days, it would have been it. We could destroy Vietnam on any Monday afternoon by bombing their dikes, the Red Black River upstream of Hanoi. Hanoi is 6 feet above sea level. If we bomb those dikes, we flood the Delta area, which grows all their rice, killing 3 million people through starvation the first year. We never did that. We fought a no-win war. We just never committed to harm the nation. But the lesson we learned is that in the future, we must act swiftly, decisively, and with some resolve to win the conflict.
I'd like to add something. In 1968, the Soviet General Staff decided that the communists were losing the war in Vietnam because the American superiority was obvious. The destruction of some parts of North Vietnam was terrible. But Kissinger and Nixon decided to surrender South Vietnam. And they surrendered it. They began to withdraw the troops from South Vietnam soon after Nixon was elected. And that was the sign to the Soviet government that South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia would be surrendered, and they were surrendered.
We want to thank you, gentlemen, for taking time out of your schedule to speak to this YAF Leadership Conference. The message of freedom certainly will not be lost within this room, and I presume our challenge is to convince our fellow Americans that we certainly should not take the threat to our freedoms that communism poses unseriously, and again, as President Reagan says, ensure that we'll never again fight a war unless we're prepared to do things necessary to win it. I thank you very much and hope to see you again at future YAF events. Thank you very much. I think the chair will authorize a 5-minute recess in order for the next panelists to organize themselves. We'll have Howie Phillips, Paul Wyrick, and Morton Blackwell here, some of the leaders of the conservative movement. So we'll reconvene at 3:36, if my time is correct. Thank you.
This is what your book looks like. Have you seen that yet? She went over to the hotel and full of Secret Service people. They escorted her to the bookstore, escorted her back out. Can you imagine?
I had this stuff out because I was just nodding on that. I forgot that the opera, you were the one who was the camera thing. We do that if you're in a can't do it if you're in the advertising. Got a question.
And Republicans will not appoint federal judges or
We put together certain panels with the thought in mind that we, as young conservatives, all too often are required to address our contemporaries, and our contemporaries are woefully ignorant not only about politics generally, but also about the conservative movement. You know, we in YAF look to certain leaders to forge the path for us to determine where we should go, how we should approach issues, what people we should support, what policies are more important than others. And I remember, excuse me, gentlemen in the back, and I remember back when I was still living up in New York, I was listening to a radio program, and there was a debate, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was a gentleman who I'd never met at the time who was representing the Committee for the Survival of Free Congress, and he was debating a person, and I believe the name was Committee for an Effective Congress. And I don't remember if it was a nationwide program or just a program that was airing in New York. And that was about the time that I was really getting involved in the development of my political conscience. And I remember meeting Paul Wyrick back in 1980 at a Heritage Foundation event, which was called to sort of bring together the conservatives out there and give them a way to find jobs in the administration, on the Hill, and agencies, etc. I decided to stay up in New York and practice law, but that's neither here nor there. We have a panel that is quite frankly exciting. We'll have Morton Blackwell joining us. We'll have Howie Phillips joining us. We did have Ann Stone confirmed, but business matters kept her up in D.C. from what I've told. So I, with great pleasure, will let you know a little bit about Paul Weyrach's past, because if there is one person who is as fundamentally important to the conservative movement, more so than Paul Weyrach, I do not know that person. Well, quite frankly, he has established a very effective organization known as the Committee for the Survival of Free Congress, which is a bipartisan conservative political action committee. He's also the president of the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation. He writes for many different newsletters and journals, and quite frankly is in many ways the conscience of the conservative movement today. Without much further ado, I take great pleasure in introducing to you all a good friend of Yass, Mr. Paul Weyrach.
Thanks very much, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity, particularly to address Young Americans for Freedom, because the recruitment and training of young people to participate in the political process, I think, is probably the most important thing that can be done as we advance our political fortunes into the latter part of the 1980s. Here we are in Dallas with conservatives having dominated the platform debate and conservatives having continued control of the Republican Party machinery to a certain extent, to the point where it is at least possible for them to continue to have a conservative nominee of the Republican Party. And so the question naturally is, where are we going in the next 4 years, and where will we be when the next Republican convention rolls around in whatever city that happens to be at? I'm so glad my fellow panelists showed up, because I was very concerned sitting alone at the front table that I was going to have to finish my speech, run out, change my glasses, get a pipe, come in and attempt to speak with a Southern accent, and imitate Mr. Blackwell, and then finishing that, run out and change into a dark suit and come up and complain about the Legal Services Corporation, imitating Howard Phillips. But fortunately, they have both arrived, and you'll be able to hear from them. My own sense of what is happening politically can be, I suppose, divided into several parts. First, in the country as a whole, the move to the right continues. As a matter of fact, the situation is exactly the opposite of when I got into politics. When I got into politics as a conservative young person, I was definitely an oddity. People would put me on display at meetings of older Republicans and conservatives, because here I was, particularly from a lower middle class, blue collar, working class family, on the wrong side of the tracks, and I was also a conservative Republican. And this was such an unusual event that perhaps I would never have achieved what little I've achieved were it not for that fact. I mean, you know, I was simply put on display, much the same, I guess, as blacks were sometime in the 1940s and 50s at certain businesses, so that people could see that, in fact, they were fair. The situation today is that the most conservative group in American politics are the 18 to 24-year-olds. They are more conservative across the board, not just on economic issues, but also on national defense and social issues. So the future definitely belongs to us and not to the left. In fact, now, fact, right now we have a problem with some of the older people because they're sort of New Deal babies grown old, and they are the most concerned about the social welfare programs and economic security in the government context. Not only are young people more conservative politically, but they are also more conservative in terms of traditional values, which gives me some great hope for the future of Western civilization, because it's quite clear to me at least that we cannot endure as a society unless people take traditional values seriously, and unless people are willing to be active not only in conservative political causes, but also in things like the rights of the unborn, for example, or something which old people ought to be concerned with, and that is opposition to the fast-growing euthanasia movement in the United States. Young people are at the forefront of many of these movements, and that gives us great cause for hope. So politically, things are still tending in our direction, and the country is moving to the right. Indeed, the debate largely is between what brand of conservatism you happen to subscribe to, or how far you want to go, with a lot of the liberals, in order to participate in the debate, having to concede certain conservative premises. Thus, we had one of the most left-wing United States senators in America, Gary Hart, flitting about the country talking about how the welfare state had failed, and how the Democratic Party, if it was going to move forward, would have to abandon some of the premises of the New Deal. That is also the advice of Senator Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts, who exceeds Ted Kennedy in his liberal voting record, but who has managed to cloak himself in a sort of neoliberal cloak, to the point where people think that, in fact, he is advocating something new. One, of course, has to be very wary of this so-called new brand of liberalism or neoliberalism, because it really doesn't propose essentially new solutions. Essentially, these people want the government as much involved as before. So the problem is not in the country. The countryside is with us, provided we can continue to frame the issue. We must continue, to the extent that we can, to seize the moral high ground and frame these issues in such a way that people are forced to choose between sound policies and the failed policies of the liberal welfare state. The problem, of course, comes when you have an incumbent administration which deviates from conservative principles, because it puts all of those people who defend the administration or are part of the administration or are in the Congress and therefore have to vote on administration proposals in somewhat of a bind, because they, on the one hand, like to defend a Republican administration which is perceived to be conservative, and don't want to really get into a contest with that administration. But on the other hand, they are faced with a very real problem, that many times the administration goes off into propositions which are not at all associated with what we believe in. So you have a problem then, not in the countryside, but in Washington. And conservatives in Republican administrations, and I've now been in Washington for 5 presidents, and I've seen 3 Republican administrations, and this has happened in every case, and has even happened in the Reagan administration. Conservatives divide into 3 camps as soon as you have a Republican administration which deviates from conservative principles. The first group says, well, we have to go along with whatever the administration says. After all, it's our administration. They may be wrong, but they are absolutely our administration, and we must defend them at any cost because the opposition is worse. The second group says, we don't have to go along with the administration. We will vote against what they do. We will quietly oppose what they do, but for heaven's sakes, we can't be vocal about it because that will simply cause us political problems. And then the third group says we must stand on principle and we have to be vocal about it because it is our responsibility to stand up and be counted. And in fact, if we don't participate in the fight, we are ceding territory to the liberals. And that is precisely how things have divided in Washington, not only inside the Congress, but outside the Congress. So you have those groups, which are identified with the conservative movement, who defend everything that is done in the name of Ronald Reagan, whether or not he ran on that platform or whether or not he even agrees with it, and who are, in essence, apologists for the administration. Then you have those people who say, well, I'm very uncomfortable with some of this stuff, but, you know, gee, I don't think we really ought to be vocal about it, because if we're vocal about it, we might bring about the worst possible nightmare, and that is the election of somebody like Walter Mondale. And then you have others who say, no, it is our responsibility to get in there and fight. Now, whereas the divisions in that regard have been very clear on outside groups, the divisions up to this point inside the Congress have not been clear at all, because most Republican members of Congress have been very, very unwilling to confront the administration, even when they are outrageous in the positions that they take. And they take it from somebody who is involved in the legislative process, they sometimes are unbelievable in the positions they take. And we've had cases where the Reagan administration has gone beyond the Carter administration in taking liberal initiatives. But we now have a new group in the Congress, which is not, of course, formed to oppose the administration, but it is formed to attempt to fight on principles and issues, called the Conservative Opportunity Society Group. It is this group that has been largely responsible for what I regard as a very good platform produced by the Republicans. Congressman Newt Gingrich and Vin Weber and Bob Walker, Mark Siljander, Dan Lundgren, Connie Mack, various others, have put together a very forward-looking group which at one and the same time is supporting basic conservative principles and traditional values while also reaching out toward the future and trying to propose a conservative agenda which is attractive to future generations. One of the problems, as Congressman Gingrich so properly explains it, is that Republicans and conservatives have so often been in the position of being solely negative. And it has been very interesting in my political lifetime to see the situation reversed, because when I got into politics, if you were conservative, you were simply against the New Deal. You were against everything that those liberals, whether in the Republican or Democratic parties, were doing. And so our positions essentially were against. Very few people understood what we were for. Now, today, if you read the statements of liberals, you have them advocating very little. They are simply screaming about positions of conservatives. And thanks to, not the administration, but thanks to the Conservative Opportunity Society gang, you have a positive vision which to a certain extent came forward in the Republican platform. So in terms of positions, in terms of actual positioning, if you will, I'm very pleased with what has happened, in the sense that conservatives have put forth a positive vision of America, not entirely, of course, but to the extent that you can on a political platform. They have been on the offensive, talking about new initiatives to carry reforms forward. They are also tying themselves to traditional values and principles. And in that sense, the conservatives and the Republican Party, to the extent that it adheres to those principles, is absolutely positioned to take advantage not only of the swing to the right, but also of that group of young people who have become disaffected with both major political parties and what they have stood for traditionally. And Gary Hart, believe it or not, attracted a lot of those people who were conservative. I looked at the demographics after some of the Democratic primaries, and a good share of Gary Hart's vote was a conservative vote. And that vote ought to go to somebody who can represent them certainly a lot better than Gary Hart. The problem will come following what I would expect would be a Reagan victory in November, which will mean, particularly if there are any coattails to it and the Republicans actually hold their own in the Senate and maybe gain something in the House, it means then that the responsibility for the implementation of this program falls on the administration and on the conservatives in the Congress. Now here's where the problem comes in. Because whereas that group of young Turks in the House is definitely of a mind to move forward in attempting to implement a lot of the stuff that was in the Republican platform and a lot more, the White House is absolutely not of a mind to support them, and in fact, in my judgment, will resist. If you understood and it were properly reported what really happened at the Republican platform, you would understand that all of the great things that we applaud in that platform were resisted by the White House people who were sent here. In most instances, there were a couple of exceptions to that, but most of the White House people resisted these changes in the platform. And that's because they represent essentially an establishmentarian point of view. They ran against Washington to get elected, but they have now been co-opted by Washington. And they are very, very concerned with preserving the existing order rather than changing the existing order. Whereas many of us who are looking to the future with great optimism and enthusiasm want to change the existing order. Because I'm not the kind of conservative that says preserve the status quo. So I think the status quo in large measure is awful. Rather, I'm the kind of conservative who says, let us not accept their premises, let us change the premises upon which we're operating. My good friend Bob Caston put it very well when he talked about the Republican platform being in many senses a radical document. And it is, because the assumptions in that document do not support the current political establishment and would change the existing order for the benefit, in my judgment, of all Americans. The problem will come when they have to begin to implement these promises that they have now fashioned. We have a question: how closely will the top of the ticket run with that platform? I think they'll be very cautious about running with the platform because I don't think that large elements of the White House support it. And while I think Ronald Reagan thinks that the platform is great, I think it has been largely demonstrated that he doesn't always write his own ticket. And so I'm not sure that that vision, which we are so pleased about here in Dallas, is going to be appropriately communicated to the American public. But even if it is, even if the President enthusiastically endorses that platform and goes forward with it, when it comes to January of 1985, and that platform gets in the hands of the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Bob Dole, or gets in the hands of Senator Lowell Weicker, who has exercised, I might tell you, virtual veto power in the United States Senate over what legislation is permitted to be debated on or is automatically sidetracked, or when it gets in the hands of some of the House leadership, which one might assume had died several years ago if you didn't see them get up every morning. The problem with the House leadership isn't that it's liberal or that it really isn't, doesn't have a high American Conservative Union rating or something like that. The problem with a lot of the House leadership, and I'm talking about the top of the leadership, is that they have ceased to fight. When I saw Bob Michael talk about Tip O'Neill being the problem the other day, I was highly amused because Bob Michael's part of the problem. Bob Michael rolls over and plays dead for Tip O'Neill. So maybe the fact that he woke up and actually, decided that in fact Tip O'Neill is a problem, we should be celebrating that he now recognizes this. Maybe he'll stop playing golf with him, and maybe he'll stop the kind of camaraderie which has prevented him from opposing the kind of tyranny which he articulated at the Republican convention. But the difficulty will be in the implementation of these promises. Now, the COS group has made it very clear that whereas in the spirit of party unity and in the spirit of getting Ronald Reagan reelected, which I certainly support, they are withholding their fire on some of the views of the administration, because I think we would probably all agree that very little is served by getting into a major civil war at a time when you're facing a formidable enemy. But in 1985, there will be no such constraint. And these men, not in a negative sense of fighting the administration, but in a very positive sense of putting forward a vision of America, intend to move forward with their program. Now, the administration has essentially two choices. They can roll over and permit this to happen, or they can fight it all the way and join the liberals to prevent it from happening. If they roll over, then the Republican Party will in fact have been co-opted by people who are futuristic, by people who are appealing to middle America, by people who have a sense of what is needed at the grassroots and what sells at the grassroots. And in that case, I think there is a future for the Republican Party. But if the last vestiges of the old guard manage to fight and resist this kind of initiative which is going to be taken, and if they succeed in stifling those forces of light which have finally descended upon the mold and the darkness that has crept into Republican leadership circles for so many years, then I think that the Republican Party is in big trouble. So when you ask the question, where are we going? I think the answer quite clearly depends upon that battle which I am confident will be taking place in the early months of 1985 and beyond. That battle which will put the forces of the future versus the forces of the past, the forces of economic development versus the forces of the status quo, the forces of traditional values versus the forces who wish to close their eyes to the reality of what is happening in modern society. That battle is the battle of the century. It is also the battle for the heart and soul of the future of conservatism. I certainly intend to be a part of it, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do hope that we'll have time for a question and answer period following the presentations of the three speakers. The next speaker is the chairman of the Conservative Caucus. I've had the pleasure of traveling on an occasion from New Jersey to Washington, D.C. after I went up and I spoke on behalf of a candidate who's then seeking the Republican nomination in New Jersey for the Senate. And I flew back, I think it was on U.S. Air with Howie Phillips, and we spoke of Young Americans for Freedom. And he told me that he was one of the founders of Young Americans for Freedom. And he also said, gee, some of the lessons and skills that were learned as I went through the organizational system have certainly helped me in my approach to politics today. And therein lies one of the strengths of YAF that I hope all of you realize, and perhaps some of you don't. But the very process of taking part in leadership conferences like this, and the very process of being a member of an active chapter or starting an active chapter, requires the same type of skills that one must have if they are to head organizations such as the Conservative Caucus. His biography reads like a who's who of the conservative movement, I won't bore you all with his successes, but the Conservative Caucus plays an influential role both through the Political Action Committee and through the Foundation in monitoring the Liberals on the Hill and monitoring the money that is spent by the federal agencies, in ensuring that issue papers get into the right hands of policymakers, and generally being the hub and the wheel of the conservative movement. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Mr. Howie Phillips.
Good afternoon. I've been in Dallas since last Thursday, and I don't know how long you've been here, but I'm sure we're all beginning to get worn down before the final events of the week reach their peak, and I appreciate your interest and patience in being here. Let me mention one item of business in which I would appreciate your assistance before I go into my remarks. I'm wearing a lapel pin that says 10% flat tax, and there are thousands of those available in the College Republican office in the basement of the convention center. There's some right here as well. We hope you will take some. We hope you'll wear them. We hope you'll distribute them to your friends at the convention hall. We believe that this is one of the issues of the future. The basic principle incorporated in the 10% flat rate tax is that federal spending should not be based on what politicians want to spend, but on what taxpayers ought to pay. And the premise is that while God requires at least a tithe of our income, Caesar has no right to require 1 cent more. And I would point out that in 1980, the budget of the federal government was $576 billion. Revenues to the federal government were $517 billion. Today, outlays of the federal government, according to OMB, in fiscal year 85, will be $925 billion. Revenues will be $745 billion. I'm glad we did not have a budget freeze in 1980, because had there been one, we would not have been able to increase defense spending as has been vitally necessary, even though the increases have not been at the level that President Reagan initially proposed and that other groups recommended, but they are better than what they were. But the fact is that if there had been a budget freeze in 1980, today, instead of suffering under large deficits, we would be enjoying significant budget surpluses, even without the 4 major tax increases which have been enacted in the last 4 years. The $50 billion down payment on the deficit, which came most recently, the $227 billion TEFRA increase, the $108 billion Social Security tax increase, and the $27.5 billion gas tax increase. Even without those, we would have had a surplus had there been a freeze. If we move to a freeze now and work toward the implementation of a 10% flat rate tax over a 3-year period, not only will American taxpayers be paying less, and not only will our economy be more healthy and vibrant, we will also have a balanced budget at a much reduced level of participation in the economy by the federal government. You know, back in 1980, the Republican platform contained this language: the Republican Party pledges to place limits on federal spending as a percent of the gross national product. It is now over 21%. We pledge to reduce it. That was in 1980. In 1984, it is 24.2% of gross national product. And unless we move to the discipline of a spending freeze and a ceiling on taxes at a 10% level, we are going to see an increasing loss of freedom and an increasingly expensive, highly regulating government based in Washington, D.C. The issue before us this afternoon in this panel discussion
is what ought to be, what is the indicated conservative strategy of victory for the future? My answer to that question is very simple. Keep our promises to the American people. That is the strategy of victory. There has been an anti-liberal majority in the United States of America since the middle 60s. The press reminds us of the losses which the Republican Party suffered in 1964, but they do not talk of the fact that in terms of the House of Representatives, some 40 seats were won back in 1966. They don't speak of the fact that while it was a close race between Humphrey and Nixon in 1968, with each getting about 43% of the vote, if you add Wallace's total to Nixon's, it was 57% of the American people that year who voted against the New Deal, who voted against the Great Society, and who voted against the no-win war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon in office did not deliver on the promises that were made to the anti-liberal majority. Indeed, he was the most liberal president in the history of the nation up until then. Under his presidency, the Great Society programs experienced exponential growth. The correlation of forces between the United States and the Soviet Union shifted to the advantage of the Soviet Union. And there were a number of other unfortunate trends that developed during the Nixon administration. Nonetheless, Nixon was fortunate to have George McGovern as his adversary in 1972, and instead of running on his own record, he was able to run against the radicalism of George McGovern. The Democrats wised up after '72, and they decided to change the subject. Instead of making it a referendum on defense, a referendum on victory in Vietnam, a referendum on values, a referendum on a sound national economy, they made it a referendum on corruption. And guess what? Corruption lost. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, recognizing that it was not enough to simply campaign as a man who would never lie to you, saw also that there continued to be an anti-liberal majority. So he portrayed himself to the American people as essentially a conservative, someone from the most conservative region in the country, someone possessed of sincere religious values as a born-again Christian, someone who had experience in reorganizing bureaucracy and balancing budgets and what have you. He was aided also by the social liberalism of Gerald and Betty Ford, and by Gerald Ford's failure to remember that Poland was indeed a satellite of the Soviet Union. During 1978, we regained the momentum, and by setting the agenda for debate on issues such as the right to life, the surrender of the Panama Canal, progress was made in what was hitherto regarded as an unassailable bastion of liberalism, the United States Senate. Bill Armstrong defeated Floyd Haskell in Colorado. Roger Jepson defeated Dick Clark in Iowa. And Gordon Humphrey defeated Thomas McIntyre in New Hampshire. Again, going on the offensive, making the defense of the United States the referendum question in 1979 and 1980, conservatives were successful in mounting an assault which resulted in the defeat of 13 incumbent liberal senators during the 1980 elections. Unfortunately, once in office, the Reagan administration did not keep its promises to the American people in terms of the expectations that were raised in 1980. Let me quote a few items from the Republican platform of 1980, which, by the way, was more conservative than this very fine platform which has been adopted here in Dallas. Quote, "We will ultimately reach the position of military superiority that the American people demand." But President Reagan's advisors for 2 years have repudiated the notion of superiority as a goal, and the President himself on June 14th said, quote, "I would prefer that we not ask for superiority. It could be counterproductive," unquote. In 1980, the Republican platform said, quote, "Over the next 4 years, Federal taxes are projected to increase by over $500 billion due to the Carter administration's policies. The Republican Party believes balancing the budget is essential, but opposes the Democrats' attempt to do so through higher taxes, unquote. I've described in general the tax increases that have occurred in the last 4 years. Let me give you the bottom line. The total through fiscal year 1985 will be a 5-year tax increase, not of $500 billion, which was the complaint directed against Jimmy Carter, but of $647.4 billion. Back to the platform. Quote, "We will work for the appointment of judges at all levels of the judiciary who respect traditional family values and the sanctity of innocent human life," unquote. There has been a significant improvement in the quality of judicial appointments during the Reagan administration. However, there has not been a faithful adherence to the pledge that was implicit in the 1980 platform. For example, on July 25, 1984, President Reagan named Andrew Fry, a member of the National Abortion Rights Action League, Planned Parenthood, and the Committee to Control Handguns, to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Another quote from the 1980 platform, quote, "We will halt the unconstitutional regulatory vendetta launched by Mr. Carter's IRS commissioner against independent schools. We will hold the federal bureaucracy accountable for its harassment of colleges and universities," unquote. We could talk about that. The administration certainly was more sympathetic than the Carter administration had been on issues like Bob Jones, but certainly not as sympathetic as it ought to have been. And one particular concern I have is the manner in which the Grove City College case has been handled by this administration, and the manner in which the administration has accepted the principle that a private institution which has never accepted 1 cent of federal money is to be treated as if it were subsidized by the federal government and made subject to federal regulation, if it merely has students enrolled at that institution who accept federal loans or grants. I think that's a mistake, and I think it's tragic that my good friends, for whom I have high regard, like Vin Weber and Newt Gingrich, voted for the misnamed Civil Rights Act of 1984, which incorporated the principles of that Grove City policy and which extended it to many areas of American life. Only 32 members of the House of Representatives voted against that so-called Civil Rights Act of 1984, and that shows that they need some more prompting from us. I regret that they need the prompting, but the fact is that they do, because that would be an extremely dangerous piece of legislation. Let me quote again from the 1980 platform of the Republican Party. Quote, "Before arms control negotiations may be undertaken, the security of the United States must be assured by the funding and deployment of strong military forces sufficient to deter conflict at any level or to prevail in battle should aggression occur. Arms control negotiations cannot be divorced from the broader political and military behavior of the parties," unquote. Both of these preconditions to negotiation have been disregarded. The precondition of superiority, which is implicit in that statement, and the precondition of linkage. Going on, quote, "The Republican Party rejects the fundamentally flawed SALT II treaty negotiated by the Carter administration," unquote. However, President Reagan's policy has been to treat the unratified SALT II treaty and the expired SALT I treaty as if they were the law of the land, even unilaterally reducing our strategic forces in order to comply with their terms. Quote, "The Republican Party deplores the attempts of the Carter administration to cover up Soviet non-compliance with arms control agreements. We pledge to end the Carter cover-up of Soviet violations of SALT I and II," unquote. There have been more disclosures than would likely have been forthcoming from the Carter administration, but the disclosures are by no means complete, as has been pointed out by Senators McClure, Sims, Helms, East,
and others on the Republican side of the United States Senate. And finally, quote, Republicans deplore the dangerous and incomprehensible Carter administration policies toward Cuba. The administration has done nothing about the Soviet combat brigade stationed there, or about the transfer of new Soviet offensive weapons to Cuba in the form of modern MiG aircraft and submarines. It has done nothing about the Soviet pilots flying air defense missions in Cuba, or about the extensive improvements to Soviet military bases, particularly the submarine facilities in Cienfuegos and the expanded Soviet intelligence facilities near Havana. Unfortunately, that's the end of the quote, unfortunately, the Soviet buildup in Cuba, the Caribbean, and Nicaragua continues, having been expanded far beyond what we faced in 1980. And the Reagan administration's practical concealment and effectual disregard of this increasingly proximate threat is truly incomprehensible. I commend the President for his correct and courageous rescue mission in Grenada, but I cannot commend an administration which repeats in Central America the mistakes of Vietnam, the mistakes specifically being the failure to define and articulate a clear-cut, coherent policy with objectives which are clear to the American people, a policy which denies privileged sanctuaries to the enemy, a policy which does not dissipate American superiority by its gradual application, a policy which does not waste one American life, one drop of blood, or $1 of treasure in a no-win venture. We need a policy we need a policy which does not, on the one hand, send George Shultz to Managua and on the other hand, support the Contras. We need a policy that has one hand only, a policy that is clearly directed in the context of a strategy of victory based on the restoration of the principles of the Monroe Doctrine and based on the goal of eliminating Soviet imperialism and colonialism for this hemisphere. The Kissinger Commission is wrong when it says that you can solve the problems of Latin America by creating an $8.4 billion slush fund to pay off some big banks, to pay off some big labor unions, to pay off some big businesses, and try to get them back into Central America. Those businesses are leaving Central America not because they have not received payoffs from the Treasury of the United States, courtesy of the taxpayers of the United States. They are leaving because the shield of American protection has been removed, and it began to be removed when the Panama Canal treaties were ratified, denying the President of the United States the right to prevent Soviet bloc ships carrying military equipment through that canal to unload in the Pacific coast ports of communist Nicaragua. And until we restore the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, we will be on, unfortunately, a losing track in Central America. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times of August 14th, just about a week ago. And let me quote to you briefly from the article because it summarizes what I've been saying and illustrates the problem which you and I face. The problem is very simply that there are some terrific people in this Republican Party. And there are a great many people who deserve our great appreciation, our praise, our thanks for the work they did on that fine Republican platform. It did not talk about eliminating the Department of Education as the 1980 platform did, and it did include some questionable language about Namibia. It did include some questionable language endorsing the national endowments for the arts and the humanities, but it is an essentially conservative document with which we can proudly associate ourselves. But the problem, my friends, is that there is all too often very little relationship between the people who give the dollars and the hours and the energy in writing Republican platforms and working in Republican campaigns on the one hand, and the people who control the departments of state and treasury and commerce and the Federal Reserve System and the White House staff in all too many Republican administrations. Here's what the Times said, quote,
After the Republican Platform Committee spent Tuesday pushing the party's campaign document to the right, Secretary of the Treasury Donald T. Regan, called up in a rage. He told Drew Lewis, the chief Reagan administration representative here, that some of the more extreme language on economic issues had to be removed. As that telephone call indicates, the party platform is taking on more of a hardline conservative cast than some of President Reagan's economic and political advisors would like. They are concerned that if Mr. Reagan is reelected, some planks could commit the administration to unworkable and embarrassing concepts, proposals to enact a single tax rate for all income levels, to eliminate taxation on interest income, and to curb the independence of the Federal Reserve Board particularly incensed the Treasury Secretary. The administration has been desperately trying to prevent the adoption of language that would lock in the president and commit him firmly against all tax increases. White House operatives succeeded today in altering some of the more troubling proposals as the full platform committee started polishing the final draft that will be presented to the convention next week. But they are prepared to swallow some language, particularly on taxes, that is not ideal from their viewpoint. Mr. Lewis told Mr. Regan that since the platform committee was so dominated by rightists, the White House should not pick too many fights. These people are reservoirs of support for Ronald Reagan, said the aide. We're not willing to alienate them at all costs, and we would do that if we tried to dictate to this convention. That's the problem. The purpose of the conservative movement has to be more than winning a nomination. It has to be more than winning an election. Our purpose has to be to put our policies in power. For too long, conservatives have contented themselves with losing as slowly as possible. Our job must be to set forth and to implement a vision of victory. And you can play an extremely important part in that by letting the candidates who come to you seeking your support for president, for vice president, for the U.S. Senate, for the U.S. House of Representatives, letting them know that you are not available for a speech and a song. You want to see what is delivered. You want to see the names of the people who are going to be running their administration. You want specifics about the policies that they propose to implement. And if you use the very formidable potential clout you have in the political process to extract a specific result from the people who need your support, then we will have a conservative strategy for victory. Thank you very much.
Americans for Freedom and was active for a number of years. I know we are here to nominate a President of the United States who very much deserves renomination. And my talk is not going to be about the strategy of the presidential election. We all have had a great deal of controversy recently about the opposition party's vice presidential nominee. I don't want to be critical of Geraldine Ferraro. I think it is fair to say, however, that Jimmy Carter made a better choice, that Walter Mondale made a better choice for vice president than Jimmy Carter did. Walter Mondale seems to be talking about some record that is different from that which we all remember. I think it is that the former Vice President Mondale does not suffer from amnesia, he enjoys it. The topic of this panel is a conservative strategy for victory, and therefore I intend to give you some serious conversation about political strategy. which I believe is critical to achieving victory. And I think it's important that we recognize how we got where we are today politically, because 25 years ago, when I started becoming active as a conservative young person, the whole debate was far different than it is today. The 1980 winning coalition may in fact be the first flowering of a new governing majority which could dominate American politics, much as the new governing majority that Franklin Roosevelt won with in 1932. I think it's important to understand why he was successful and what we have to learn from that experience. Notwithstanding the fact that we now have a reasonable majority, a partisan Republican, but not a conservative majority in the United States Senate, I believe it is still possible for the Republican Party to lose control of the Senate this year. And I think that it is almost a certainty that the 26 Republican House seats which were lost in 1982 will not be regained in 1984, much as I would like to see it happen. And if this happens, in my view, it will be more our Republican Party's fault than the Democrats' accomplishment. For about 3.5 years, the liberal Democratic leadership has done all it can to evoke moral outrage against the Republican Party and the Reagan administration. The halls of Congress and the national news media have rung with the liberal Democrats' emotional attacks on the Republican Party's alleged faults. Bloated military spending, insane nuclear weapons, deliberate policies of unemployment, favoritism to the rich, unfairness to the poor, raping of the environment, callous insensitivity to women, racist attitude toward blacks, and reckless imperialism against reformers in Central America. Now, all of these charges against the Republican Party, I believe, are bum raps, but they work politically, each with a different mix of voters. Too often, the Republican response to this attack has been pathetic. Inordinately defensive party leadership has too often used its media access simply to drone endlessly, "It ain't so, it ain't so." In short, the Republicans have too often abandoned the rhetorical initiative. Liberal Democrats choose most of the debate topics, and Republican leadership obligingly stays away from other issues. This is the formula for my party to remain forever the normal minority party, achieving office only when the opposition blunders badly. How different it is now from the years leading up to the 1980 elections. In the latter 1970s and in 1980, the liberal Democrats were kept on the defensive. They were bound with hoops of steel to groups with McGovernite agendas, and the liberal politicians were forced to take left-wing stands on the issues of great importance to millions of traditionally conservative Democrats and independents. But ongoing battles and frequent votes in both houses of the Congress kept the public attention in the years leading up to the 1980 coalition victory on the very issues where the liberal Democrats were most vulnerable. Rather than the issues that they are now raising against Republicans during the Reagan administration, the liberal Democrats then were dealing with charges of gun grabbing, government-funded abortions, parental rights, compulsory unionism, voluntary school prayer, tuition tax credits, forced school busing, crushing tax burdens, and giving away our canal in Panama. Each of these issues was a net benefit to conservatives, and each issue drove wedges between major elements of the old Franklin Roosevelt coalition. How many times during this Reagan administration have the Democrats forced both houses to vote on the MX missile? 6, 12, 20? How many votes have they forced on U.S. policy in Central America? It seems like there's one about every week. I think it is safe to say that the congressional record will continue for the balance of this election year, when the Congress comes back in session, to be filled with debate and record votes on these issues. And the major TV and print media will delight in covering these battles. On the other hand, how many fights and votes in Congress will Republicans force in these closing weeks of the Congress on the issues that are most damaging to the liberal Democrats? If the experience of the last 30, 40 months is any guide, virtually none. It happens that by the choice of the leadership of both parties in the Congress, in the years leading up to, in the years 1981 and 1982, leading up to the 1982 elections, there were no votes in either house on gun control. And in fact, to this day, for 5 years, there has not been a vote in either house on gun control. There were, during that 97th Congress, virtually no votes on right to life, virtually no votes on school prayer, no votes at all on pornography, no votes on the death penalty, no votes on tuition tax credits, virtually no votes on forced school busing, no hard-fought up-and-down votes on defense preparedness, no vote on eliminating Hobbs Act exemption for prosecution of union violence, virtually no votes on the political use of compulsory union dues, and there was only one short fight in both houses on the balanced budget tax limitation amendment, which took place with short notice over a short period of time and too soon before the adjournment to have much impact. And thus, most of the conservative issues on which millions of people had been recruited and activated were virtually absent from the newspapers and absent from the television news programs. For 10 years, the congressional record had been a virtual gold mine of record votes on these issues, but not in 1981 or 1982, and to a great extent not in 1983 or in 1984. Why is this? Has the Republican Party been afflicted with terminal niceness? Do we so enjoy the heady business of governing that we forget how we got here? Did we learn any lessons in 1980 or in 1982? After considerable thought, I have concluded that the general run of Republican top leadership, particularly in the Congress, is now unable or unwilling to lead. The activism, which in 1988 created at least a temporary change in the balance of power in favor of the Republican Party, was not created by the then existing party hierarchy. That activism was created by a man named Ronald Reagan and a galaxy of conservative leaders largely in the Republican Party structure, but not in its top leadership. No, terminal niceness is not the problem of the Republican Party today, nor was it the problem in the past. In fact, Republican Party officials stand ready to take action which will harass or embarrass the liberal Democrats, with only one major reservation: no Republican may be offended. Unfortunately, a leadership which strives above all to offend neither Senator Jesse Helms nor Senator Lowell Weicker is not suited to lead a majority party. Lowest common denominator politics is not Tip O'Neill's way. As long as Speaker O'Neill believes that an action will do net damage to his opposition and net benefit to his own party, he takes that action. He doesn't worry much about the sensibilities of the conservative members of his party in the Congress. If they get out of line, he handles them as he attempted to handle Phil Gramm. That is, he throws them out of the party. And Phil Gramm's example convinced many boll-weevil Democrats not to anger their liberal Democratic leadership because they were not in a position to do what Congressman Gramm has done. The Washington Post is always generous with advice for Republicans. Last August 30th, they ran an editorial entitled, a newspaper editorial, not a signed editorial, but it's the paper's position, entitled, quote, "Giving Up the Senate," close quote. After noting the current weakness of the Republican Party in many states with Senate races in 1984, the Post lavished praise on the Republican Senate. They said, quote, about the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, "They have put on the back burner many issues that belong there. Their leaders have often been brilliant, and their backbenchers have been suitably quiet. They have certainly been more unified than Senate Democrats in recent Congresses. Should they lose control, it will be less from the merits than from bad luck. That's baloney. Unity is almost always attainable if one operates on a lowest common denominator basis. And the high-intensity issues that are now languishing and have been languishing on the back burners of the Senate and the Congress as a whole were those very issues which were forcefully raised by conservative backbenchers in the years leading up to the 1980 winning coalition victory. The very issues which are of net benefit to the Republican Party and net damage to the Democrats. No wonder the Post is pleased. Last summer, I had an opportunity to debate with Democratic National Chairman Charles Manat, and I reviewed the high-intensity liberal versus conservative issues which have been largely or entirely ignored since the 1980 elections, and Chairman Manat replied that he hoped these issues would remain buried. He is no dummy. Major party leaders, in many cases, including many in elected or appointive office, have lost, if they ever had, the entrepreneurial spirit necessary for solid political growth and sustained success. The strength of the president's winning coalition is sapped by consensus decision-making, bureaucratic fear of controversy, and paralysis which masquerades as pragmatism. Successful political leadership necessarily has a confrontational aspect. Skill at confrontation is not incompatible with the nice guy image. You all remember the comments, "I paid for this microphone," and "there you go again." Defensive political tactics have their uses, but wise leaders seek out battles in areas where their opponents are most vulnerable. If you do not go on the offensive, you never win ground. In a series of defensive contests, you hold the line in some cases and you lose ground in other cases, but long-term you only lose. Republicans who behave this way are the only ones the Washington Post loves to praise as statesmen. The pervasively defensive mentality of too many of our current Republican leaders can be measured by reviewing the newspaper headlines and noting the radio and TV news broadcast. By a ratio, I would say, close to 10-1. News items for about 3.5 years have described the Republican Party leadership as, quote, defending, close quote, rather than carrying the fight to the opposition by criticizing the liberal Democratic leadership. Here at this convention, we have an exception to that, but I want to assure you, if you read the history books, you will find that during his administration, Franklin Roosevelt, despite his huge majorities in both houses of the Congress, Roosevelt constantly directed most of his thunder at Republicans rather than respond defensively to their criticism. It is now clearly too late to take full advantage in 1984 of all of the issues which made possible the victories of 1980, and on which many of the liberal Democratic candidates are vulnerable. The grassroots organizations which poured activists into the 1980 campaigns of President Reagan and so many other winning conservative candidates still exist. Almost all of these groups are better funded now, and they have larger memberships. They grew in finances and in mailing lists not because their issues were at the top of the agenda in the Congress, but because their leaders became proficient as organizational entrepreneurs in print media advertising, direct mail, television and radio appeals, telephone solicitations, and other forms of fundraising and recruitment. What these sources of activism lacked in 1982 were sufficient reasons to throw themselves and their adherents fully into the congressional battles of 2 years ago. And unless the situation changes, they will largely lack these reasons in 1984. Virtually every effective group's leaders have privately expressed disappointment, ranging from dismay to disgust with this lack of leadership which I have been describing to you. For 3 years, I was the President's liaison to all the conservative organizations in society. And I will tell you frankly that sometimes I felt as if I were the receptionist at a home for battered wives. I heard the stories every day. If Republican candidates are to run in 1984 with that 1980 coalition largely revived and enthusiastic, I believe that the issues of 1980 will have to be reclaimed, and with vigor, and immediately. The process is relatively simple, but it will not be easy given the current and historic party predilections. Simply put, I believe that each of the high-intensity liberal versus conservative issues must be brought to the fore. For 3.5 years, we should have been bringing these issues repeatedly to the floors of both houses of Congress. We have not done so. We've had one vote here and one house on this issue and one vote in the other house on that issue. Unlike the liberal democratic predilection for having repeated votes time and time again, as I mentioned on the MX in Central America, we're voting on it almost every week. For maximum effect, legislative battles need to have 2 or more months advance notice before they get to the floor for House or Senate consideration. Frankly, we do not have time at this point to do that to the extent that it needs to be done. But very few of the grassroots supportive groups have instantly ready armies of DC-based lobbyists, as do the major left-wing pressure groups. For communication, the 1980 winning coalition must depend largely on direct mail to television and radio appeals, which often must be filmed weeks in advance of their broadcast. They must depend on word of mouth and other channels which require a fairly long lead time. But given the invigorating battles which are needed and the time to activate their people, the groups that helped build the 1980 GOP candidates' campaigns can and will do so again. These groups, I know, are capable of organizing voter registration drives which could overshadow the highly successful efforts of Reverend Jesse Jackson, and they can generate more grassroots activism than did organized labor. But White House meetings with organization leaders are not enough. Repeated presidential remarks on these issues are no longer sufficient. Without actions, these issues will have limited impact in 1984, no matter how cordial are the personal relationships between the leaders of grassroots groups and leaders of the Republican Party. President Reagan, I believe, will be reelected. He could run a strong campaign against what appears to be a very weak ticket and be handsomely reelected, but in a lonely landslide, as was President Nixon in 1972, being of little or no help to other conservative candidates. In 1972, Richard Nixon beat George McGovern by a margin of 23 percentage points. But the Democrats in that same year increased their U.S. Senate majority from 55 to 57. And they won 291 of the 435 House seats. And it is also possible, in an uncertain world, that events in 1984 still could place the president in a close re-election campaign, in which case the fragmentation of the 1980 coalition would put more than the congressional races at risk. Even if we whip the Democratic presidential ticket badly, if there is a disaster in the congressional races, that would surely cripple the president's second term. Legislative initiative would pass entirely into the hands of the Democrats. Senate confirmation of presidential appointees, including Supreme Court justices, would be much in doubt. Cabinet officers and other appointments would become routinely revocable on the precedent of what they did to James Watt. And thus the 1984 congressional election is a critical election, which could in fact be described fairly as the last chance for that 1980 Reagan coalition. There are formidable obstacles to the plan of action which I have recommended here to you this afternoon, and I will list them for you, at least some of them. First, and I'll try to word these graciously, first, the heterogeneous staffing of the administration. Second, the deadening effect of the GOP's consensus decision-making. 3, the difficulty of teaching a whole generation of old leaders new behavior. 4, the failure to understand how it is often possible to lose legislatively but win politically. 5, the notion that social issues are somehow like mechanical rabbits that can keep those interested in them forever running futilely behind them on a track. 6, the expectation that leaders and organizers of supportive mass-based groups will be willing to pretend that token efforts on their issues are real efforts. 7, the current preference for making a small retreat rather than risking a small defeat. 8, the false notion that somehow this year we can pick 1 or 2 issues and get the whole 1980 coalition activated again. But you must remember that the President himself is already committed and on the public record on the right side of each of these issues I have listed for you. Not only the morally right side, but the politically right side. And therefore there are ways over, under, around, and through these obstacles. I must say I am greatly encouraged by the efforts of this growing band of conservative activists in the House of Representatives. I travel across the country, and everywhere I go, people are electrified and excited that suddenly here is a group of congressmen, Vin Weber and Newt Gingrich, and Bob Walker and Connie Mack and Duncan Hunter and on, wonderful younger conservatives who are carrying the battle. But there are other steps which could and must be taken. For instance, it would be possible to issue to the relevant administration appointees unmistakable specific orders to push forward with vigor on all of these legislative fronts. Then it would be possible to demote or fire a few who drag their feet, a practice of which we have no examples in the last 3.5 years. 3, we could identify and fire a few of our leakers who sneak over to the media to snipe at the President's views. We could, number 4, have meetings with the congressional party leadership and try to convince them of the need to end this lowest common denominator party legislative decision makers. And finally, and this is critical and is to some degree going on, we must encourage these people the Washington Post called conservative backbenchers, who are personally strongly committed to the President's position on each of these useful issues. We must encourage these people not to be, as the Post described it, suitably quiet. We must encourage them to force battles, to use the rules in the House and the Senate, to get record votes when our party leadership fails. For protracted legislative struggles leading to record votes on these political issues, the time to start was early 1981. But at minimum, the time to start is now. Thank you very much.
It's already 5 o'clock. I've been instructed by the staff that we could take but one question. Who all here, Betty, who has a question for the panelists? Dave Nolan? And would you please, can you direct the question to one panelist?
Looking for 1988, do you see the increase in grassroots participation that's necessary for
Morton?
conservatives to, number one, get the nomination for conservatives, and secondly, to win the presidential election?
I have no reason to think that we will not have continued growth of the sources of activism. And I'm telling you a literal truth when I say that none of the major sources of activism of 1980 has done anything but grow in the period since 1980. They've grown in members and finances and in political expertise. And one of the encouraging things, of course, is that it is still, in large degree, a hallmark of conservative grassroots organizations that we train activists. And while I just happen to mention that, I will point out that I have this school this coming weekend, which Bob made reference to. I have applications here. If you're able to stay over and want to come to my youth leadership seminar sponsored by the Leadership Institute, it's the most intense 2-day school in politics. We still have some vacancies at the school, and we can let you in if you want to come see me afterwards and get copies of our brochure. An application will be at the law school at SMU, Southern Methodist University, on Saturday and Sunday. We have that. So, but to be specific about it, yes, I think that the activism is going to be there to win for a conservative nominee in 1988. I think it is premature for us to spend a lot of time trying to jockey around among current conservative potential candidates in 1988. That is too far down the road. In my view, we must re-elect Jesse Helms, we must elect Roger Jepson, we must defeat Max Baucus, we must, et cetera, you know the drill. We have very important fish to fry between now and November 6th. I don't think it's wise for anybody to start jockeying right now for that nomination. But I think that the potential most assuredly is there. We are still growing in activism and in expertise, and in members and finances. And as long as we are continuing to grow at that rate, it's going to happen. But you see, we didn't know. I mean, I have my good friends down there. I'm glad you addressed the question to me because I got a chance to plug my school. But Howard Phillips and Paul Wyrick and many other people who were active in the early 70s and built the conservative groups, built groups of our own, assisted others. That's another great thing that we do. We're always happy to help run workshops or programs for other people. We didn't know in 1975 or 1976 or 78 that we didn't know that 1980 was going to be the year of the long knives for the liberal Democrats. What we did know was that if we do our job, if we keep building, the time will come when we'll get them. And 1980 came around. I always remember 1980 as the night I hugged Paul Wyrick, because we cleaned house. George McGovern and Frank Church and Birch Bayh and Jimmy Carter and Warren Magnuson and Gaylord Nelson and Al Ullman and all that crew we beat. But we couldn't have predicted that even in 1979. I came close to predicting it in early January of 1980, but we don't know. We do know this, that we're not smart enough to plan the economy 10 years down the road, essentially. We shouldn't think we're smart enough to plan the electoral politics that far down the road. Do our job, build at the grassroots. You all are doing key work in creating activism at the grassroots, and you can't predict who that fella or gal that you sign up at a membership table this fall on a college campus. And you don't know exactly what that person's going to do. You may never see that person again, or that person 10, 20 years from now may be in the United States Senate. You cannot tell. But you know that if you do enough of that, you recruit enough people, they're going to be congressmen and senators and key staffers and cabinet officers and whatever. You just look at the backgrounds of people in our movement and you'll see that's where they came up.
Morton, for purposes of denying that hug took place, I give the floor now to Paul Wyrick to respond to the question.
Well, I take second place in no one for my affection for Morton, but given who's active in the political scene these days, particularly in San Francisco, Morton, I do wish that you would refrain from reminiscences. Let me just say that I think Morton is entirely correct. We have a lot of work to do. I think these campaigns are getting entirely too long. To begin to talk about 1988, not to plan for it, not to really have a focus in mind to the point where we're doing the behind-the-scenes work. But when I see presidential candidates declaring their intention to run before the 1984 election is even over, I think that the public is going to get sick of it, and it's going to be a detriment to our political system. I think, though, that we have the capacity, thanks to the work, by the way, of Morton Blackwell and a lot of other people, we have the capacity, with the rules situation being what it is, to nominate a conservative, providing we have one run. Because I personally feel that we will be confronting President George Bush before the 1988 election, which means we will have the problem of taking on an incumbent president. And with all due respect to the great affection that I have for Jack Kemp and the tremendous enthusiasm with which he is greeted, I do not think that Jack Kemp will stand up and run against an incumbent Republican moderate president. I don't think he's got it. I don't think he will do it. I hope I'm wrong. I don't think so. And I think a lot of these other candidates that are now being bandied about will end up not running under those circumstances, which means that we either have to produce a candidate who has the guts and determination to run under those circumstances, the way Ronald Reagan did against Gerald Ford, I might add, and who can be elected. Or we are going to have to look to some other alternative, because I can tell you this is one participant in this National Republican Convention who will not support George Bush for president in 1988.
I've been advised that we have time for but one more question. You, the gentleman from Kansas.
I had a request to the gentleman on the far right.
Well, actually, Mr. Wyrick just assumed that position, but with which I fully concur, but I'll be happy to take it.
You were talking, you had some very, I guess you could say, hardcore conservative beliefs.
They were all on the 1980 Republican platform, by the way.
Well, I was wondering if these go on, do you think the American people will accept these conservative platform and
Basically, your question is, do we have to run as liberals in order to get elected?
well, such a hard conservative stance.
Well, I don't think balancing the budget, cutting taxes, or defending America is anything but a moderate, middle-of-the-road, intelligent, reasonable position. George Bush may think it's nutty or kooky. I think it's good old-fashioned mainstream Americanism. It is not much that made Ronald Reagan the nominee of the Republican Party in 1980, and it is not much that contributed to his defeat of Jimmy Carter, who appeared as much. The fact of the matter is that there exists in America, and has, as the polls demonstrate since 1966, an anti-liberal majority, which is fully supportive of positions that I have taken if they are well articulated and defended. For example, I don't think there's any reasonable American who would reject the notion that we have gained not one bit of security or one bit of freedom by signing pieces of paper bearing the names of Lenin or Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Andropov. They've done nothing to promote world peace. But if you play the liberals' game and accept their premises, sure, that's going to hurt. One of the problems that liberal Republicans like George Bush and Jim Baker and Howard Baker and Bob Dole and so many others who run the Republican Party and the Reagan administration have is that they're ashamed of what we believe. And the liberals know that you can take a doctrine which is not sound. Ours happens to be a sound doctrine. You can take one which is not sound, and if you're proud of it, you can escape criticism. You know, we've heard this Republican platform characterized as ultra-conservative. I heard Sander Van Oker on Sunday say, of course, it's impossible to govern America this way. This is not an ultra-conservative platform. As I say, it's less conservative than the 1980 platform. Why is it that there has been no scrutiny of the Democratic platform, which celebrates perversion and homosexuality and welfarism and so forth? That's what is losing elections. It's that leftism of George McGovern and Walter Mondale which the American people are rejecting. The American people want a policy that will be based on the defense of America's vital interests. I think President Reagan is going to win substantially this year. I share Morton's concern that, as in 1972, in the absence of a referendum question that reaches into the congressional races, we will not make the gains that ought to be made in the House and the Senate. I believe the referendum question there is very simple this year. Shall America be defended? And that means something like high frontier, strategically, and it means something like the defense of the Western Hemisphere from Soviet aggression. I believe that that is I think if President Reagan said, I want a Congress that wants to defend America, and if candidates were rated on that basis, seats would be won in the House and the Senate more easily.
No, we don't have time for a follow-up on that. I think we should take the time to thank our panelists. These are the individuals who have, in many ways, provided the energy and the vision which will allow events such as this to take place. I do apologize for rushing and not allowing a further Q&A, but the policy was established by the staff, and as you know, the chairman of YAF always adheres to the staff's wishes.
Mr. President of the United States, you're practicing, right?
Yes, I'm practicing. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We have heard speakers tell us that all during their adult life there has not been anything but a liberal chairman of House subcommittees. We have heard speakers tell us about the indecisive leadership which caused them directly to languish in prison of war camps in Vietnam. We have heard speakers talk to us about the freedom fighters in Central America. We have talked to each other about ways to improve our campuses and chapters and communities. All of this for the reason that within this room, I have stated, unlike the room in Dallas, the convention center, this room contains the hope for the future. The vision for yourself, the vision that you have for yourself is quite important. The vision that we have as a group for this country is even more important. Young Americans for Freedom has been on the forefront, has been at the cutting edge of many issues. We have many friends, no more, though, than the gentleman who will next speak to us. Bill Rusher serves as the publisher of the National Review, one of the more important conservative journals in this country, if not on this planet. I could list his biography. It reads as a who's who of the American conservative and political movement, but a great friend of Young Americans for Freedom, a great friend of ours. Please extend the warmest welcome to Mr. Bill Rusher.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. When I walked in and saw Howie Phillips and Paul Wyrick and Morton Blackwell speaking, I thought for a moment that they were giving you a briefing on the situation in Israel, because less than a month ago I was there with all three of them, and we had a fine time at the time of the Israeli elections, and then traveling around to the holy sites and some of the other fascinating things in that country. I'm sorry I couldn't hear all they had to say, but I've just come from the Oregon delegation, where they had asked me to speak to them. I want to begin by paying my own compliment to the job that I understand YAF is doing here in Dallas. Some planning and intelligent planning and hard work has gone into it, and I think you're going to see rather promptly the payoff in terms of attention for our candidate, attention for our principles, and attention for YAF. That is as it should be. It's no secret to anybody who has YAF's best interests at heart to know that it has been through some very rough years. Not without fault on its part. But I believe, I sincerely believe, I certainly hope that the turn has been made. There are very considerable evidences of it, and that you will all be working together hereafter to advance the cause of conservatism, which you have done so much in the past to advance. So the first thing I must do is compliment you and wish you well. Bob Dolan was absolutely right in saying that it is in this room and other rooms where the young are gathering that the real future of our country lies. There are times when I could wish that wasn't so. Sometimes one wonders whether or not the youth are going to get the word and then go out and do the necessary. It might be better if it were all left to the wise old heads. As the saying goes, though, if youth only knew, if age only could. And so we rely on youth because we must. And I must say that I don't think that in this particular generation we're going to be disappointed. You have a different situation, strategically different, than my own generation faced when I was your age. In those days, there were no, YAF had not yet been founded. There was an occasional free enterprise society on a college campus, unconnected with any other free enterprise society anywhere, and generally with little or no membership, and quietly patronized and ridiculed by the bright and alert young leftists who dominated the situation. There were, from 1947 forward, young Republican clubs, and non-college young Republican clubs too, of course. But the college clubs started in about 1947. As it happened, I was in law school, and even before entering law school, I had called on the then chairman of the Republican Party, Carroll Reese, in his office in the Republican National Committee in the spring of 1946, and said, "What can I do to help?" And he said, "Well, Ralph Becker, the chairman of the Young Republicans, is going to start trying to get young Republican clubs going on college campuses. Why don't you start one up at Harvard?" So, condensing quite a bit, I did start one and became the first president of the Harvard Young Republican Club. Began in November 1947, and soon there were similar clubs on many, if not most, other campuses. We prided ourselves on that Harvard Club. We were a very militant bunch. I think I sort of inserted that flavor into it early. We called ourselves, very presumptuously, the Republican West Point. You can see what we were planning to do. And I must say that there turned out to be more truth than poetry in that description. We had such members as John Ashbrook, a member of the club, and just counting presidents of it alone after myself, in the early to mid-1950s, one of the presidents of the club was Roger Allen Moore, who subsequently became the parliamentarian for the Goldwater forces in 1964, and then for the Reagan forces in both 68 and 76 and 80 and 84, and is now general counsel to the Republican National Committee. And in 1956 approximately, the president of the club was a young fellow named Donald Hodel, who has gone on to be Secretary of Energy. And in about 1960, by which time they had divided the law school Young Republican Club from the undergraduate club, a fellow in the law school by the name of Dermot O'Scanlan became president of the law school Young Republican Club, and I've just been to the Oregon delegation where he invited me to speak because he is chairman of the Republican Party of the state of Oregon now. And so that one club, and I haven't by any means ended all the mentions of names that I might, but these are just people that happen to be close to me. That one club has provided quite a lot of leadership for the Republican Party, and other clubs have done the same. YAF, coming along in and after 1960, contributed a new element, though, to the situation. After all, if all we wanted to do was provide trained cadres for a political party, then the chances are the young Republicans served the purpose. And by the way, they did train cadres. The whole draft Goldwater movement, as you probably know, and as I describe for the umpteenth time in this new book of mine, The Rise of the Right, was simply the young Republican national dominant group of the 1950s, grown old enough to participate in Republican senior politics, and doing so state by state and becoming the draft Goldwater mechanism. The nomination of Barry Goldwater in 1964 was engineered by the leaders of the Young Republican National Federation from the decade of the 1950s. But there was more. By then there was more, because beginning in the mid-1950s and developing during the later 1950s, there had been laid a serious foundation of conservative doctrine, drawing together the various traditions of classical liberalism and through the road to serfdom, and Burkean traditionalism through Russell Kirk's conservative mind, and anti-communism in a philosophical sense through Whittaker Chambers' book Witness. So that by 1960 there was a corpus of ideas that were distinguishable from the Republican Party. It was prepared to act within the party, or if necessary without it, but in any case was principally dedicated to conservative principles, and only secondly to or tertiarily to winning for a political party. And that's where Young Americans for Freedom came in, and that's when it came in, precisely then in 1960, to be the youth expression of this new emphasis on ideas. YAF would not be the producer of the party cadres or the trainer of the party cadres, the West Point of the Republican Party. It would be the crucible, the cradle of the keepers of the tablets, as Bill Buckley calls us, the people who watch and guard and promote ideas. That is YAF's characteristic and specifying function. That doesn't mean that we can't remain interested in or get interested in politics and be effective in politics, as you are, I think, being here, and as I have tried to be, although my life has been mostly, I think, testimony to my preference for ideas over political action in the first instance. Political action, and it's a thought that I tried to suggest in this book, political action ought to grow out of ideas. And in the case of the conservative movement, that is exactly, of course, what has happened. In the beginning is the word, and after that comes the political organization. You can see in the case of the conservative movement how during the 1950s it concentrated upon getting its ideas set up, coordinated, and applicable to passing events and crises and questions, issues. Then in and about 1960-61, a big turn into politics. The formation of what later became the National Draft Goldwater Committee under Cliff White, the formation of the New York State Conservative Party, which played a tremendous role in that very liberal Republican state, and by 1964 already, the nomination of Barry Goldwater. That is the sequence in which things should occur, to get your ideas in order first and then go into politics and promote those ideas. And this has enabled YAF, curiously enough, I think, to be more consistent in its conservatism than many other people who had more experience in politics and ought to have known as well as YAF and didn't. I give you the best example I know and one of the best tributes to YAF. In 1968, 4 years after the defeat of Goldwater. The Republican Party met at Miami Beach to nominate a presidential candidate. Nelson Rockefeller thought he was a candidate. Ronald Reagan was very doubtful that he ought to be a candidate because he'd only been governor of California 2 years, which he felt many people would consider an insufficient base from which to bid for the presidency, but nonetheless he drew closer and closer to the candidacy, particularly after the assassination of Robert Kennedy. By the time the convention opened, he was, in fact, a full-blown presidential candidate. By which time, unfortunately, a lot of conservatives had gotten themselves committed to Richard Nixon, at least on the first ballot. And it was heartbreaking to go out onto that floor and see so many of my old friends who had been with us in Goldwater now working for Nixon, while those of us who had remained flexible enough worked for Reagan. But I haven't lost my point, which is YAF. I would judge that in 1968, half of the conservatives at Miami Beach were for Nixon. Half were for Reagan, maybe, about half. Between them, they had the overwhelming number of people there, delegates and otherwise. Rockefeller was not a serious contender. The Young Americans for Freedom National Board met at Miami Beach, 21 people, and voted on the question of whom to endorse. And to their eternal credit, they voted to endorse Ronald Reagan 19-2. That's what's known. That's what's known as keeping your eye on the ball, when all about them were losing theirs and blaming it on you. Well, now, where do we stand today? As I say, your situation is strategically totally different from that that faced us in the 1950s or even 60s or 70s. We have a well-established political philosophy that has been thought through. We believe philosophically in the tradition of Burke, in the concept of order, in the need for tradition in human affairs. We do not believe that progress without more is necessarily and always desirable, or that change is. We believe that you have to know what comes next, and that there is a great deal to be said for what has come before, just because, perhaps, it has come before. But we also believe in that great 18th century discovery, classical liberalism, having, of course, absolutely nothing to do with the modern variety, a grand strategy, essentially, for liberating the minds of men and for enabling them to make their own political and economic choices so far as possible in a human society. A liberating thing to do. It creates enormous energies, releases rather enormous energies. It doesn't create them because the energies are within the individuals. That is the grand strategy of conservatism, to free mankind. And then, in our time, our era, the great enemy, the great challenge, the great danger that must be guarded against is communism. There will be other enemies, there have been in the past, there will be in the future. Ours is communism. And it must be resisted far more effectively than liberalism is able to resist it. Liberalism which is half attracted to it. So we have this philosophy well established, and since 1964, because the liberals never took the Republican Party back again, for 20 years we have had, by and large, a party willing to be the political vehicle of our principles. I don't blame the Republican Party for picking Nixon. I blame the conservatives for picking Nixon. We shouldn't have been willing to settle for that. And that is why when I come to that in my book, I call the chapter The Blunder of 1968. We could have avoided a great deal, but we didn't. And so it was not until 1980 that Ronald Reagan had his rendezvous with the leadership of America. But certainly the party has never been more unified, never more conservative, never more creative, never fuller of really new ideas than it is in the era of Reagan and legislators like Bush and Kemp and Gingrich and the others who are doing the heavy thinking for the future of this country. There will be future battles, both over the principles and over control of the party. This can't last forever. I keep hearing Richard's remarks, now is the winter of our discontent, made summer sunshine by this son of York, and all the clouds which lowered about our house in the deep bosom of the ocean bury it. This is indeed the summer sunshine of the House of York. But there will be fights in the future. Doesn't bother me in the least. To begin with, it is written in the nature of things that this is the way we progress, is by the process of fighting to some degree. Secondly, we are on the battlefield. We are recognized as one of the principal contestants. We will be heard from. We will prevail in part. And if we lose this or that battle, we know we can fall back and regroup and fight again. This is a fully panoplied organization for the betterment of mankind, this conservative movement of ours now, and it has staying power. So I'm not afraid of those battles to come. I think we, as a matter of fact, ought to be a little mature about this. Not preserve the old lager mentality beyond its time, not get to pining for the days of the caves in Yan'an, so to speak, of the conservative movement. I think that we might better understand, well, just to take one thing. Since conservatives begun winning, a certain number of opportunists have come our way. I find some of my conservative colleagues unwilling to open the door and let them in. Let them in. Let them in. That's what opportunists do. They go with the winning side. Don't forget who they are or what they are, but accept their support. And don't regret it. It is a tribute to what you have accomplished and to what you stand for. The liberals, well, I happen not to have a high regard for the staying power of the liberals narrowly considered, by which I mean people of roughly the order of Teddy Kennedy. But I do have a healthy fear and respect for the left. It is the left and the conservatives, the hard left and the principled conservatives, who are going to have the final battle for the future of the world, because they are the only two that have thought deeply about the nature of man and the relation of man to society. They have come to exactly opposite conclusions. The left, fundamentally, the hard left, is a totally materialist concept of the nature of man. It makes no room for a spiritual dimension in human events and developments in nature. And it, therefore, we think, fatally misconceives mankind and his future. But at least they have conclusions on the deeper subjects that neither reactionaries, merely reactionaries, nor liberals have. But the liberals, defeated as they have been at the polls and are going to be again this year, have retreated simply into their twin Alpine redoubts. You know, Hitler was supposed to have at the end of World War II an Alpine redoubt up there in Bavaria. He was going to pull back in there and hold out. Never worked quite that way, but the liberals have two, and they have retreated into them already, and they have barricaded them, and they're in there hurling down their imprecations upon us. One of them is the media. The other is the academy. Now, these are big institutions in our society. The liberals have quite a lot of room to move around in those two, which of course feed on and interrelate with each other. And I think that if we propose, and we do, to lead American society and not just parts or chunks of it, that we cannot concede the media and the academy to liberalism. I think we ought to tighten our belts and go right in there after them and drag them kicking and screaming out of their Alpine redoubts. This is a large order, but I think it can be done. I think the process has already begun. It is, after all, basically just a process of replacing the idea structure that is dominant in the intelligentsia with a more accurate and more powerful idea structure, which is modern conservatism. Now, you can't expect people who have already achieved maturity and become hostages to fortune as the heads of universities and or departments and media elite to change horses in midstream. They are liberals and they will stay liberals. But they can and will be followed in the next generation of our media personnel, and I am speaking of the media before the academy because the media battle, I think, will come first, is in some respects already joined. They can be replaced and followed by people who are conservative. We see already in Stan Evans' training school for young journalists and the work that is being done by the Institute for Educational Affairs in financing college conservative newspapers, in the other efforts that are being made to go to work on the journalistic profession and put young conservative journalists in the lower echelons. They'll rise. Some of them may sell out and change. Some of them may tire and go to other things, but others will stay right there. And in 20 to 30 years, I promise you, we will be seeing a very different kind of media than we are seeing today. But I say to you, as in certain respects, if there were such a thing, the Politburo of the conservative youth of America, if you don't mind that particular metaphor, encourage your people to go into the media. There is a tremendous battle to be fought in there, and there is every reason why, in the long run, we should win it. The academy, the same things basically apply, although the ultimate prize is greater still and will take longer to win. But the technique remains the same. We must encourage people to get into teaching and into research and into the foundations. The day may come when we can take back even the Ford Foundation. Not that I want to encourage you to hold your breath, because they will not be as foolish as old Henry was and let it get away from them. They will hang on. They know a big gun when they see it. But in one way or another, we can move into the foundations, and not just the new ones that are sympathetic anyway, but the older ones that aren't. After all, in all human affairs, the issue isn't so much who's winning as where's the battlefield. That, of course, is what Ronald Reagan has done. He hasn't had everything his own way. But he has them fighting in Congress now, not over whether the defense budget shall be increased, but whether it shall be increased 7.5% as he wants, or only 3.5% as Tip O'Neill wants. That's where the battlefield is now. He has them argue almost always on his terms, on the issues as he raises them. And that is what we ought to be doing in both the media and the academy, it seems to me. The ultimate prize, which I also allude to in this book for those of you who are interested in it, is so breathtakingly great that I hesitate to mention it in what is, after all, a fairly impromptu little talk to you here in Dallas, but let me mention it anyway, because I don't have all that many opportunities to speak to you. I'll tell you what I really think. I think that as we get further from it in distance, it begins to appear that the 18th century, which was a remarkable century and which had a lot of pluses in it for mankind, the inflow of scientific knowledge, the overthrow of the feudal systems, the absolute monarchies of Europe and so on, the establishment of the United States, also contained a very dangerous and brought about what amounted to a very dangerous turn in human thinking. Mankind decided, a lot of mankind, a lot of influential people in the 18th century, that God was dead, that we could get along on our own, that mankind hereafter, with the use of reason, which Voltaire enshrined as a goddess, you will recall, at the time of the French Revolution, would make his own way in the world. And the political figures of that era, confronting this new tendency, temporized. I don't see what else they could do. I think that it is a great credit, for example, to the founding fathers of this country, creating a nation at just the time they did, that they left the question of the relationship of the society to a religious base relatively open. They did not establish a church. They insisted upon total freedom of religion, and they provided for amending processes for the Constitution. What more could they do? And then they left us, as they had to slug it out across the ensuing 200 years. And what has happened is that in the world at large, as Paul Johnson, I think, demonstrates brilliantly in his wonderful book, Modern Times, which I commend to all of you who haven't read it yet, is that with the collapse, the largely effective collapse of religious faith around the world, there flowed in to fill the vacuum a new type of politician, in effect a God politician with a political religion. That is what your communisms and your various other isms amount to. An attempt to make politics do the work that up until the 18th century had been done by religion. And even in the United States, although we remained much closer to and more seriously religious, because we took so seriously and because our own secular humanists encouraged us to take so seriously the so-called wall between church and state, we totally secularized our society, and when we ran through the moral capital of 100 or so years, wound up with what amounts to a moral collapse, which is now upon us. Now, all this is going to take a lot of working out, but I think the moment of the turn, if you can imagine such a thing, was the moment when Alexander Solzhenitsyn rose at the Harvard commencement in June 1978. Read that speech carefully, preferably in the National Review translation. Some of the others aren't as good. And you will find there that that he is calling for nothing less than the rethinking, not the rejection, but the rethinking of the 18th century Enlightenment, the reincorporation of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the ongoing history of mankind. Talk about large orders. It won't be, fortunately, perhaps, up to Yaff to accomplish that. But I think you should be aware that this is the kind of thing out there that maybe the 21st century will be involved with and have to fight its way through. And that there is no reason why that is why I say the academy is the last and the most important battle. Because it is in there somewhere that the battle will take place in all likelihood, in the first instance. But that's nothing more than just a peek down the road at a time that neither you nor I will see or have an awful lot directly to do with. Our job, every man's job, is in the here and the now, his time and his place. And if you understand now that you are the proud products and inheritors of a big, sound, strong movement that looks to you for its future leadership, then I have no doubt how you will respond. As some of you undoubtedly know, I had the privilege to be present, good God, even then as an elder, at the founding meeting of Yaff on the lawn of Great Elm in September 1960. Marvin Liebman and Brent Bozell and I were having a drink about as far back as the back wall over there while the young delegates chose their name. And Marvin said, "You realize that makes the rest of us old Americans for freedom, or oafs?" And we didn't like that idea very well. And that evening in the sort of little glassed-in conservatory, or whatever you call it, a lot of plants around, they had a little get-together after dinner and asked me to say a few words. And I've forgotten what I said, except I remember what I quoted, which was a passage in translation from Goethe, which appears in Chambers' book, Witness. And I like to quote it to Yaff meetings simply because of that historical nexus. I think it is apposite for your future and ours. It goes, "Heard are the voices, heard are the sages, the worlds and the ages. Choose well your choices, brief and yet endless. Here eyes do regard you in eternity's stillness. Here is all fullness, ye brave, to reward you. Work and despair not."
Mr. Russia has indicated that he'll take some questions. So why don't we I know that we could stay here for about another 10 hours or so, but why don't we, not with him again, why don't we just entertain a few questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Having been a founder and editor of a student newspaper for this past year, I ran into a dilemma. That is approaching contemporaries of my age in the South we're trying to communicate the conservative philosophy and trying not to be too sophisticated about it, and then at the same time trying not to be too simplistic. I use the policy of Mr. William Buckley Jr. and National Review to hold their ground and to remain sophisticated enough but yet be simplistic. And with students, how do we go about resolving that problem?
Well, I think you have to be fairly realistic. I would not expect, or perhaps even want, a college publication to attempt to turn itself into a miniature national review, complete with all the curlicues that we manage to pack into considerations of ideas. I think that it is perfectly proper for you to some extent simplify, to some extent narrow your focus so that you're dealing, there is no reason why a large principle could not be applied to a local question, whether there should be, whether student funds should be expended for abortion or whatever the particular question is, or pornography, and so on. You can take the large principles and apply them to the local situations, and that, I think, is what I would suggest that you do. And for the rest, if there will always be the relatively few youngsters capable of absorbing the whole concept of conservatism at that age, and they should have National Review called to their attention and gotten into their hands, if at all possible. Yes.
Basically, back about the time of the bicentennial observance, you had at that time advocated perhaps a new independent political party to kind of bring, I suppose, this anti-liberal coalition into being. Do you feel that that type of a thing is really worthwhile now, or whether we have adequate independent lobbying organizations that make the current parties proper?
I suppose the world goes by so fast that I had better give the younger members here a briefing on that particular era in my twisted life. In about 1974, just after a meeting, by the way, the Commodore in New York with the National Board of YAF, seeing some interest in their part in the idea of a new party that would really, you see the need, and it was perfectly clear by then, I think, was to bring these economic conservatives, the old traditional Republican base, and the social conservatives, the formerly Democratic, blue collars, ethnics, and so on, into the same party. They were both anti-liberal. And it was really more an anti-liberal coalition than it was in some senses an explicitly conservative coalition. And the Republican Party showed not the slightest intention of doing this, as it proceeded to demonstrate by rejecting Reagan again in 1976 and nominating Ford. So in my despair, and I guess I should add that at that point I had been active in Republican politics of one sort or another for 30 years already, and I was getting a little tired of never having the Congress, at any rate, in our hands. I wrote this book, The Making of the New Majority Party, suggesting a new party that would not a third so much as a replacement second party, and that would replace the Republican Party almost as fast as the Republicans replaced the Whigs in the period 1854-56. And what you are asking quite properly now is how I feel about that 8 years, I guess, further on or more. I don't apologize in the least for the analysis. I was in touch in those days with then Governor Reagan, and he agreed entirely with the analysis, but he thought it could be done in the Republican Party. I presented him with a copy of the book in April 1975. I said, "But Governor, they're not going to nominate you," meaning 1976. Well, no, he said, that remains to be seen. And he saw, and I thought I was brilliantly vindicated. But of course he waited 4 years, and then he was brilliantly vindicated. The question for the future, though, is very much up for grabs. Will the Republican Party, I guess it's less up for grabs now that I see this convention than I thought it was. Will the Republican Party forget that it can lose and will lose if it has only economic conservatives in its basket? Will it remember that it must appeal effectively to the social conservative component of the anti-liberal coalition? And there are a lot of people who won't, or who find that a very hard study, quite sincerely so. Some of them have never met a social conservative. They sit up there on their country club porches and just don't know why people can't understand that they deserve to run America. And they have lost enough for the Republican Party, it seems to me. And Republican conventions in the past have not had large numbers of social conservatives on hand, so that the representation was almost entirely economic conservatives. And I think the question is therefore up for discussion in 1988 and decision, and thereafter as well. But I'm more hopeful now. The party is very content with its conservatism at the moment and is going to be richly rewarded for it, I hope and believe, in November, so that there isn't going to be an awful lot of pressure from the Mac Mathiases to chase us up the road, you see. And for the time being, it was always obviously better to do it in an existing party if it could possibly be done there. So let's stick with this, and with some hope that it will work. But I'll tell you this, I am not a slave to a name any day. We walk away from the coalition of anti-liberals or conservatives that can really win for this country. I'm going to try to find some way to put it together again.
Just one question. We are quite concerned about Central America and the related issues. Certainly the organized left in this country and the college campus uses this issue to highlight, from its perspective, American hegemony throughout the world. And we do realize that there is a chance that the campuses might explode if we are required to take other steps to neutralize communist aggressors in that area of the world. Do we see an easy path to A, the victory of communism in Central America, and B, if the path is not easy, would you predict the campuses to react as they did in the 60s during the Vietnam War?
Well, I think that after the election, this is just a guess, if Reagan gets the kind of mandate that I hope he will get, and the Congress, we thin out these Democrats at least in the House of Representatives a little bit and hold on to the Senate, that you will get a Congress. Well, the Congress has already shown itself a little bit more willing to finance support of El Salvador, not yet the Contras in Nicaragua, but since Barnes changed after Duarte came up to Washington and so on. I think that situation is likely to get a bit better. I was rather surprised to hear a private series of comments by one of the leaders of the Nicaraguan Contras just recently in Dallas. And what surprised me was he was rather more optimistic about their prospects. And I don't think he was just kidding this particular group. I think he really thinks, rightly or wrongly, that they're going to get somewhere, too. So I think the situation may resolve itself without things that would cause the campuses to erupt. But if we did get into any kind of a military situation of an ongoing type, with the media allowed to photograph the corpses and interview the mother of the corpses and this kind of thing, yes, sure, the left would touch off the campuses. And it probably would not be quite as successful as Vietnam, because Vietnam was so much further away, and because the military effort there had simply not been prepared by Johnson and the others. It was just the worst of all possible situations. He didn't have a plan for winning the war. He was, whereas I'll promise you, anything Reagan goes into, he will have a plan, I think, for coming out the other side of, if need be, all the more so because of Lebanon. So, on the other hand, I don't suppose, I hope that this group and generation of young people will never get the assignment that they had to be given in the mid-1960s, which was in effect the one that Churchill gave the garrison at Hong Kong at the outbreak of World War II, which was to stand there and die to the last man if necessary, because there was no other way around it or through it. And to the credit of YAF, I think that in those years, which were just plain ghastly from its standpoint, and where all sorts of local compromises had to be made and defeats had to be sustained. But nonetheless, at least at the national level, YAF remained sturdily and soundly conservative throughout. I guess that's about it. It's after 6 and I have to get to the next place, so thank you very much for having me.
Before everyone leaves, I have to be rude and ask you for a few minutes more of your time. I have several important announcements that need to be made, and I'll keep this as quick and short and to the point as possible.